The pregnancy test slipped from Elena's trembling fingers, clattering against the convenience store floor. 2 pink lines. Impossible. Her 6-month contract marriage to crime boss Adrian De Lorenzo was ending in 3 days. She'd be free. Finally free from the dangerous world she'd stumbled into for money. But now, carrying his child, everything had changed. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Adrian telling her to come to the penthouse, that they needed to talk. Elena's blood ran cold. Adrian never summoned her at midnight unless something had gone terribly wrong. She didn't know it yet, but her husband had just discovered a betrayal that would make leaving him the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. Elena Vargas had exactly 72 hours left. 72 hours until the marriage that had saved her life would finally, mercifully end. 72 hours until she could disappear into the vast anonymity of New York City and pretend the last 6 months had never happened. 72 hours until she was no longer Mrs. Adrian De Lorenzo, wife to one of the most powerful and feared men in the northeastern United States. She stood in the fluorescent glare of a 24-hour convenience store on the Lower East Side, staring at the pregnancy test display like it might bite her. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday, and the store was empty except for a board clerk scrolling through his phone behind bulletproof glass. Outside, November rain hammered the sidewalk, turning the street into a river of reflected neon. Elena's hand shook as she reached for the cheapest box. Her nurse's scrubs, pale blue and wrinkled from a double shift, felt too tight, suddenly restrictive. She had been telling herself for 3 weeks that the nausea was stress, that the missed period was because her body was finally relaxing after months of anxiety. But deep down, in that place where truth lives before we're ready to face it, she'd known. She paid cash, didn't make eye contact, shoved the box into her oversized purse, and walked back out into the rain. Her studio apartment in Alphabet City was a 4th-floor walk-up in a building that should have been condemned years ago. The stairs creaked ominously under her weight. The hallway smelled like old cooking oil and someone's enthusiastic marijuana habit, but it was hers, or it would be once the divorce was finalized and Adrian's final payment cleared. Inside, she locked the door with all 3 locks, dropped her purses on the sagging futon that served as her couch, and stood in the center of the 12-by-12 room that contained everything she owned. The bathroom was barely bigger than an airplane lavatory. Elena unwrapped the test with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, read the instructions twice, even though they were painfully simple, and did what needed to be done. 3 minutes. The box said to wait 3 minutes. She set a timer on her phone and sat on the closed toilet lid, staring at the water-stained ceiling. How had her life become this? 2 years ago, she'd been a nursing student with a bright future and a loving family. Then her father got sick. Pancreatic cancer, aggressive and merciless. The medical bills piled up faster than mountains in a storm. When he died 8 months later, he left behind Elena, her heartbroken mother, and $200,000 in debt that the insurance companies refused to cover. Elena had tried everything. Extra shifts, payment plans, small loans that became big loans with interest rates that should have been illegal. When her mother had a stroke from the stress and ended up needing round-the-clock care, Elena made choices she never thought she'd make. She dropped out of nursing school, took a job as a hospital aide because it was the only medical work she could get without her degree, and sold everything of value her family had owned. It still wasn't enough. That's when Marcus, a friend from her old neighborhood who'd made very different life choices, told her about an opportunity. A businessman who needed a wife for public appearances. 6 months, no questions asked, complete discretion. $250,000, enough to clear her debts and set her mother up in a decent care facility for years. She had asked what kind of businessman needs to buy a wife. Marcus had given her a look that said she already knew the answer. He told her it was the kind who doesn't ask questions about your debt. The kind who can make problems disappear. She should have walked away. She should have found another way, any other way. But desperation makes fools of us all. And Elena was nothing if not desperate. Her phone's timer shattered the memory. 3 minutes. Elena stood on legs that felt like water and picked up the test. 2 pink lines, clear as day, unmistakable, devastating, pregnant. The test fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering against the chipped tile floor. Elena gripped the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection in the spotted mirror. 24 years old, dark circles under her brown eyes, her black hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was, exhausted, terrified, trapped. How had this happened? They'd been so careful. The marriage was a business arrangement, nothing more. Except for that one night 3 months ago, when everything had gone catastrophically wrong. It had been after a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Elena had played her part perfectly, the demure wife in a borrowed designer gown, making small talk with politicians and businessmen who probably had bodies buried in their backyards. Adrian had been different that night, less cold, less controlled. He'd actually talked to her in the car ride home, asked about her mother, remembered details from conversations she hadn't realized he'd been listening to. Back at his penthouse, he'd poured them both whiskey. They talked for hours, and somewhere in the whiskey-warm darkness, talking had turned to touching. Touching had turned to her bedroom door clicking shut behind them. In the morning, they'd both pretended it hadn't happened. Dot went back to their careful distance, their professional courtesy. The arrangement would end as planned, and they would both move on with their lives. Except now there was this 2 pink lines that connected them forever. Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out with shaking hands. It was a text from Adrian, penthouse. Now we need to talk. Her heart stopped. He never contacted her this late, never summoned her outside of their scheduled public appearances. In 6 months of marriage, he'd maintained rigid boundaries, separate bedrooms in his penthouse when she stayed over. Minimal private interaction, absolute professionalism. Something was wrong. Elena grabbed her jacket and was halfway to the door before survival instinct kicked in. She couldn't go to him like this. Not with the pregnancy test, sitting on her bathroom floor like evidence at a crime scene. Not when she didn't know what she was going to do about it. But another text came through. It said it's urgent, and that the car's outside. She looked out her window. Sure enough, a black Mercedes sedan was idling at the curb, completely out of place in this neighborhood. Marcus stood beside it, watching her window. Whatever this was, it wasn't optional. Elena changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a sweater, and shoved the pregnancy test into her purse. She couldn't leave it where her nosy super might find it, and headed downstairs. Marcus opened the car door for her. He was a big man, 6'4", and built like he bench-pressed cars for fun, but his eyes were kind. He asked if she was okay. She said honestly that she didn't know and asked what this was about. He told her it wasn't his place to say, just that the boss wanted to see her. That's all he knew. The drive to Adrian's penthouse in Tribeca took 20 minutes through rain-slick streets. Elena watched the city slide past the tinted windows and tried to calm her racing heart. Maybe this was about the divorce papers. Maybe he wanted to finalize everything early. Maybe. The car pulled into an underground garage. Marcus escorted her to a private elevator that opened directly into Adrian's penthouse. The doors slid open, and Elena stepped into a world that still felt utterly foreign to her, despite the dozens of times she'd been here. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson River. Modern art that probably cost more than most people's houses hung on white walls. Everything was sleek, expensive, and cold, a perfect reflection of the man who owned it. Adrian stood by the windows, his back to her. Even in silhouette, he was striking. 6'2", broad-shouldered, moving with the controlled grace of someone who'd learned early that weakness gets you killed. He wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. He said, "Thank you for coming," without turning around. His voice was deep, controlled, with just a trace of an accent that hinted at his Italian heritage. She asked if she had a choice, and that made him turn. Adrian De Lorenzo had the kind of face that made people nervous. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes so dark they were almost black. At 32, he'd built an empire that operated in the shadows of legitimate business, and everyone knew it, even if no one could prove it. He was handsome in the way that predators are beautiful, dangerous, and compelling in equal measure. He told her there's always a choice, though sometimes the alternatives are unpleasant. He crossed to the bar and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, offering her one. She didn't take it, telling him she doesn't drink anymore. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Adrian noticed everything. He asked since when. She just said recently, wrapping her arms around herself. Suddenly cold, despite the penthouse's perfect climate control. She asked him what this was about. The divorce papers were ready to sign. 3 more days and their arrangement was over. He told her that's what they needed to discuss. He set both glasses down and turned to face her fully. The arrangement had become complicated. Elena's stomach twisted. She asked how it was complicated. He asked if she knew Thomas Brennan, who's been his financial manager for 5 years. She shook her head. The names and faces of Adrian's business associates blurred together. She'd never paid much attention to the details of his world. Adrian told her that Thomas had been skimming money from his operations, nearly $15 million over the past 2 years. His voice was perfectly calm, but Elena had learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He was furious. He said Thomas got greedy, got sloppy, and that he discovered the theft 3 days ago. She asked what this had to do with her. He explained that Thomas tried to cover his tracks by creating a paper trail that leads to her. The words didn't make sense at first. Elena stared at him, waiting for the punchline. She told him that was insane, that she didn't know anything about his business. She'd never touched his money except for the payments he made to clear her debts. Adrian moved closer, and Elena fought the urge to step back. He said he knew that, but Thomas was clever. He created shell accounts in her name, forged documents showing regular withdrawals, and even manufactured email correspondence discussing the transfers. To anyone investigating, it would appear that she'd been systematically stealing from him since before they were married. Horror washed over her in cold waves. She asked why he would frame her. Adrian told her it was because she's disposable. The bluntness of it stung, even though Elena knew it was true. She was always meant to be temporary. If suspicion fell on her after the divorce, he could claim he discovered her theft and cut her loose. No one would question it. She pointed out that he said he knew she was innocent. He said he did. Adrian was very close now. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody. He told her he'd known her for 6 months, and he knew she was many things, but a thief wasn't one of them. She told him to tell people the truth, to show them Thomas is the real thief. He said it wasn't that simple. He turned away, running a hand through his dark hair. It was the first genuinely frustrated gesture she'd seen from him. He said that Thomas is dead. He was murdered 2 days ago, shot twice in the head in his apartment. The police were calling it a robbery, but it wasn't random. Someone wanted him silenced. Elsna's knees went weak. She sank onto the leather couch, her mind reeling. She asked who killed him. He said he didn't know yet, but whoever it was now has all of Thomas's documentation showing her as the thief. Adrian poured himself another whiskey and downed it in one swallow. He told her they were going to use it. She asked how they would use it. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Elena saw something like regret in his eyes. He explained that there are people who want to hurt him, rival organizations, enemies he's made over the years. If they believe she stole from him, they'll assume he cares enough about the money to care about her. They'll come after her to get to him. The full horror of the situation crashed over her. She realized he was saying she was in danger because someone thinks she stole money she never touched. He confirmed it. She told him to tell them the truth, to put out a statement, to do whatever people in his world do to spread information. Adrian's voice hardened as he asked if he should admit that someone inside his organization was able to steal $15 million without his knowledge, that he was compromised, vulnerable. He said that kind of weakness gets you killed in his business. The second he shows that kind of vulnerability, every rival will see an opportunity to strike. She asked if she was just supposed to hide for the rest of her life. He said no. He sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He said she was supposed to stay married to him. The words hung in the air like smoke. She said absolutely not. Elena stood up, backing away. Their agreement was for 6 months. She'd played her part, done everything he asked. She stood beside him at fundraisers and smiled for cameras and pretended to be the loving wife. She was done. He told her if she left now, she'd be dead within a week. The certainty in his voice stopped her cold. She accused him of exaggerating. He said he wasn't. Adrian stood as well, and suddenly the penthouse felt too small. He told her his world doesn't forgive easily. Right now, as his wife, she has protection. His enemies know that touching her means war with him. But the moment those divorce papers are signed, she's just a woman who stole $15 million from a very dangerous man. Every lowlife looking to earn favor with his rivals will be hunting her. She told him to protect her anyway, to hire bodyguards, to hide her somewhere safe. He explained that would only confirm that she matters to him, which would make her a permanent target. He moved closer, and Elena found herself backed against the window with nowhere to go. The only way to keep her safe was to make it clear that she's untouchable, and she was only untouchable as his wife. Elena's mind raced through options and found none. She asked for how long, he didn't know. Months at least, maybe longer. Until he found who killed Thomas and recovered the evidence he created. Until the situation stabilized, she asked what she was supposed to tell her mother and her friends. She was supposed to be free, supposed to get her life back. Something softened in his expression. He knew this wasn't what she signed up for. He knew she wanted out, but he was asking her to trust him a little longer. He asked her to stay married to him, to stay under his protection, and he swore he would keep her safe until this was resolved. She realized she didn't have a choice. He quietly confirmed she didn't. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the pregnancy test in her purse like a stone. She should tell him, should lay all her cards on the table, and let him know that this situation was infinitely more complicated than he realized. But looking at his face, at the cold calculation barely masked by concern, she knew what would happen. A child would make her even more valuable as a target, more vulnerable. He'd lock her away completely, cage her in the name of protection, and maybe he'd want the baby. Maybe he'd decide that a child was useful, a legacy to secure his empire. Elena couldn't risk it, not until she understood what she was dealing with. She heard herself say that she needed guarantees, new terms. Adrian raised an eyebrow, noting she was negotiating.
She replied that he was asking her to risk her life,
and she thought she'd earned the right to negotiate. She forced herself to meet his eyes, to project a confidence she didn't feel. She wanted her own security team, people she could trust, not just his men. He said done. She wanted regular updates on the investigation, no secrets, no keeping her in the dark about threats. He agreed. And she wanted her own space. She wasn't living in this penthouse like a prisoner. She would stay somewhere secure, but she needed privacy. He considered this, then shook his head. Not possible. The penthouse was the most secure location he had. She would stay there. She replied that in that case she wanted her own room with a lock he didn't have the key to. Those were her terms. She crossed her arms, telling him to take them, or find another way to keep her alive. A smile ghosted across his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him in months. He said she was tougher than she looked. She replied that she'd had a rough year. He agreed to her terms, her own room, her own security team, full transparency on the investigation. He extended his hand and asked if they had a deal. Elena looked at his hand, at the strong fingers that had signed away her debts and trapped her in a world she'd never wanted. She thought about the pregnancy test in her purse, about the impossible choice growing in her belly, about the life she'd planned that was dissolving like sugar in rain. Then she shook his hand. Deal. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and strong, and for just a moment Elena felt something pass between them. Recognition, maybe. Or the memory of that one whiskey-soaked night when they'd forgotten to be strangers. Adrian released her hand and stepped back. He told her to pack whatever she needed from her apartment, and that Marcus would take her first thing in the morning. She would move in here tomorrow. She asked if it had to be that fast. He said the threat was real. The longer she was exposed, the greater the danger. He moved to a desk and pulled out a new phone, still in the box. He told her to use this from now on. It was encrypted and secure, and her old number was compromised. She took the phone numbly. This was happening. This was really happening. Adrian said there was one more thing, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. They would need to be more convincing as a couple. More public appearances, more visible affection. If his enemies were watching, and they were, they needed to believe this marriage was real. She said it was never supposed to be real. He agreed quietly that it wasn't. The weight of unspoken words hung between them. Elena remembered his hands in her hair, his mouth on her neck, the way he'd whispered her name in the darkness like a prayer. She remembered waking up alone, the sheets still warm where he'd been, and knowing without being told that it could never happen again. She said she should go, that it was late. He said Marcus would drive her home, and that he'd stay outside her building tonight just in case. She asked just in case what? Adrian didn't answer, but his silence was more frightening than any words could have been. Elena made it to the elevator before her composure cracked. As the doors slid shut, she caught a glimpse of Adrian, standing by the windows again, silhouetted against the city lights, looking utterly alone. The car ride back to her apartment passed in a blur. Marcus tried to make small talk, but Elena couldn't focus. Her mind kept circling back to the same impossible truth. She was pregnant with Adrian De Lorenzo's child, trapped in a fake marriage that had just become horrifyingly real, and caught in the crosshairs of people who wanted to hurt her for a crime she didn't commit. Back in her apartment, Elena pulled out the pregnancy test and stared at those two pink lines until they blurred. She had to tell him. It was the right thing to do, the moral thing. But something held her back. Some instinct for self-preservation whispered that the moment Adrian knew about this baby, she would lose what little control she had left. He would make decisions for her, about her, without asking what she wanted. The child would become another piece on his chessboard, another asset to protect or weapon to wield. Elena couldn't let that happen. Not yet. Not until she understood what kind of man Adrian De Lorenzo really was beneath the expensive suits and controlled danger. She pulled out her new encrypted phone and stared at it. Only one number was programmed in. Adrian's. A direct line to the man who held her life in his hands. Her old phone buzzed. A text from her mother's care facility. It said her mother had a good day today and asked about her. Tears blurred Elena's vision. Her mother, who'd raised her to be honest and brave and kind. What would she think of the choices Elena had made? What would she think of this mess her daughter had created? Another buzz, this time from an unknown number on her old phone. The text read, "I know what you did. You can't hide behind him forever." Elena's blood turned to ice. She stared at the message, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Someone knew. Someone was watching. She grabbed the new phone and called the only number in it. Adrian answered on the first ring. He asked what was wrong. She told him she got a threat on her old phone. Someone knows about the money, about her staying with him. He told her to read it to him. She did, her voice barely steady. There was silence on the other end. Then he told her to pack now, not to wait until morning. Marcus was already on his way back. She wasn't spending another night in that apartment. She started to argue, but he cut her off, saying this wasn't a debate. Someone was already moving against her. He told her to pack what she needed and be ready in 10 minutes. The line went dead. Elena stood frozen in her tiny apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her old life. She thought about running, thought about grabbing her passport and whatever cash she had and disappearing into the night. But where would she go? She had no money, no resources, no way to protect herself. And now she had a life growing inside her that depended on her survival. She started packing. 15 minutes later, Marcus was loading her 2 duffel bags into the Mercedes. Elena took one last look at the apartment that had been her sanctuary, her independence, her hope for a fresh start. Then she got in the car and let it carry her away. The penthouse was quiet when she arrived. Adrian met her in the foyer, still dressed despite the late hour. He told her room was ready, the 3rd door on the left. It had its own bathroom and a lock, as promised. She thanked him. He caught her arm as she moved past him. He told her she was safe here and gave her his word. She looked at his hand on her arm, at the way his fingers circled her wrist completely. She told him his word didn't mean much to her, that they barely knew each other. He told her to get to know him then. He released her, but didn't step back. He said they were going to be spending a lot of time together, so they might as well make it bearable. She asked if that's what this was, bearable. He replied that it could be worse, and she said it could be better. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He agreed it could. They stood there in the dim foyer, 2 strangers bound by a contract that had become a cage, and Elena felt the weight of all her secrets pressing down like stones. Her conscience whispered for her to tell him about the baby, but she couldn't. Not tonight. Not when everything was already spinning out of control. She wished him good night. He returned the sentiment. She made it to her room and locked the door behind her. The space was beautiful. A king bed with soft white linens, modern furniture, another wall of windows overlooking the city. It was a far cry from her studio apartment. A gilded cage was still a cage. Elena unpacked mechanically, hanging up the few clothes she owned, arranging her toiletries in the pristine bathroom. When there was nothing left to organize, she sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the pregnancy test one more time. 2 pink lines. A secret that grew heavier with every passing hour. She had 72 hours until the divorce was supposed to be finalized. 72 hours that had turned into an indefinite sentence. 72 hours that had become forever. Elena lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, one hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. Somewhere in this city, someone wanted her dead. Somewhere in this penthouse, a man who was her husband, but not her husband, planned to keep her alive by any means necessary. And somewhere inside her, a tiny cluster of cells was becoming a person who would bind her to Adrian De Lorenzo in ways no contract ever could. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. This was her life now, suspended in fear, trapped between danger and protection, carrying a secret that could change everything. Tomorrow she would be strong. Tomorrow she would figure out how to survive this. Tomorrow she would decide what to do about the baby. But tonight, Elena simply lay in the darkness and wondered how her life had gone so wrong so fast. The city glittered outside her window, indifferent to her fear. And in the penthouse's main bedroom, Adrian sat on the edge of his own bed, staring at his phone. He'd lied to her tonight, not about the danger, that was horrifyingly real, but about his reasons for wanting her to stay. The truth was simpler and more complicated than murder and money. Adrian De Lorenzo had fallen in love with his fake wife, and he'd just been given an excuse to keep her, even if it destroyed them both. Elena woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, and a moment of pure panic before memory crashed back. The penthouse, Adrian, the threat. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, having fallen asleep on top of the covers sometime after 3 in the morning. Her phone, the new encrypted one, showed 9:47 a.m. She had 4 missed calls from Adrian, and a text telling her breakfast was in the dining room when she was ready, and that they needed to discuss security protocols. Security protocols? As if her life had become a military operation. Elena showered in the enormous marble bathroom, using products that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. She dressed in jeans and a loose sweater, one of the few outfits she owned that didn't scream broke hospital worker, and tried to ignore the nausea that rolled through her stomach in waves. Morning sickness, another reminder of the secret growing inside her. The penthouse looked different in daylight, less intimidating, almost beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a sweeping view of the Hudson River, the water sparkling under November's sun. The decor was modern and masculine, but not cold. Warm wood accents, leather furniture, worn soft with age, bookshelves lined with actual books instead of designer accessories. She found the dining room by following the smell of coffee. Adrian sat at the head of a long glass table, reading something on a tablet. He'd changed into dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. His hair was still damp from a shower. He looked up when she entered and wished her good morning. He asked if she slept. She said not much and eyed the coffee pot on the sideboard with a longing she couldn't act on. She mentioned he said something about security protocols. He told her to sit and eat first, gesturing to the spread laid out. Fresh fruit, pastries, what looked like a vegetable omelet. He said Mrs. Chen makes enough to feed an army and she'll be offended if you don't try something, he explained. Mrs. Chen was his housekeeper who comes in 3 times a week. He poured himself more coffee and assured Elena she was very discreet and completely trustworthy. Elena sat and took a croissant just to have something to do with her hands. She asked how many people have access to the penthouse. He said it was a good question and set down his tablet. Just Mrs. Chen, Marcus, and his head of security, James Rodriguez. That was it. Everyone else required advanced clearance and an escort. She asked about his business associates and other family members. Something flickered across his face as he told her he doesn't have family anymore. And his business associates meet him at offices or neutral locations. Never here. This was a private space. The loneliness in those words made Elena's chest ache unexpectedly. She took a bite of croissant to cover her reaction. She mentioned he'd said something about a security team for her. He told her James was putting it together now. 3 people, 2 for day shifts, 1 for night, all former military or law enforcement, and all vetted personally by him. Adrian pulled up something on his tablet and turned it toward her. They were their files. He said she could interview them if she wanted, to choose who she was comfortable with. Elena scanned the information. The profiles were thorough, with photos, backgrounds, and service records. 2 men and 1 woman, all with impressive credentials. She said she wanted the woman on her detail, Rebecca Santos, a former NYPD detective who had been in private security for the last 5 years. He said it was a good choice and made a note. She could start tomorrow. Elena asked about today. He said today she had Marcus and him, that they weren't leaving her unprotected. Elena set down her croissant, her appetite gone. She told Adrian she couldn't live like this, with constant guards, locked in a penthouse. She had a job, a mother in a care facility, a life. He told her gently but firmly that she had a job. He'd contacted the hospital that morning and told them she needed emergency family leave, and they were very understanding. Anger flared hot in her chest. She said he had no right. He replied that he had every right, that she was his wife and she was in danger. Showing up at a public hospital where anyone could get to her would be suicide. He leaned forward, saying he knew this was hard, that it wasn't what she wanted. But until they identified the threat and neutralized it, her normal life was on hold. She asked about her mother, who she visited 3 times a week. She would worry if she didn't come. He said they would arrange secure visits, and James would coordinate with the facility. Adrian's expression softened slightly. He wasn't trying to cut her off from everyone. He was trying to keep her alive long enough to have a life to go back to. The reasonable tone made it harder to argue. Elena forced herself to breathe, to think past the panic. She agreed and asked what else she needed to know. He told her she doesn't go anywhere without security. Not to the lobby, not to the parking garage, nowhere. If she needed something, she was to tell Marcus or Rebecca and they'd get it or arrange an escort. She felt like a prisoner. He said she was protected, that there was a difference. She wondered if there was. Elena stood, needing to move, to pace. From where she was sitting, it looked the same. Adrian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low. He said he knew what it's like to lose freedom, to have your choices taken away. If there was any other option, he'd give it to her. But there wasn't. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. For the first time, Elena wondered about Adrian's past. How did someone become a crime boss? What choices had led him to this life? Before she could ask, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his whole demeanor changed. Shoulders tensing, jaw tightening. He said he needed to take this and told her to stay there. He disappeared into another room, leaving Elena alone with the remains of breakfast and her spiraling thoughts. She walked to the windows and stared out at the city. Somewhere out there, someone wanted her dead. Someone believed she'd stolen money she'd never touched, committed crimes she'd never dreamed of. And the only thing standing between her and that threat was a man she barely knew, trapped in a marriage that had never been real. Her hand drifted to her stomach again. In a few weeks, she'd start to show. In a few months, there would be no hiding this. She needed a plan, needed to figure out what she was going to do. But first, she needed to survive. Adrian returned 15 minutes later, his face carved from stone. He told her to get dressed, something nice but practical. They had to go out. Elena's heart jumped. He had just said she couldn't go anywhere. He corrected her, saying she couldn't go anywhere without security, and this was necessary. He was already moving toward his bedroom. He told her to wear the blue dress from the gala last month, that they needed to look like a happy couple. She asked why, what was happening. He paused in the doorway. His attorney had called. Someone leaked information about the theft to one of his business partners. There were questions about his organization's financial stability. He needed to do damage control, and that meant making a very public appearance with his devoted wife to show that everything was fine. She pointed out that everything was not fine. He agreed, but said they didn't need to know that. 30 minutes later, Elena stood in front of her closet, staring at the blue dress. It was beautiful designer silk that draped perfectly, elegant without being flashy. She'd worn it once to a charity event where she'd smiled until her face hurt and made small talk with people who terrified her. She could barely zip it now. The nausea had made her lose weight, but her breasts were already fuller, more sensitive. She'd need new clothes soon. Another problem to solve, another secret to keep. Elena applied makeup carefully, covering the dark circles under her eyes. She styled her hair into a sleek ponytail and put on the diamond earrings Adrian had given her as part of her wife costume. Real diamonds, probably worth more than her car used to be. When she emerged, Adrian was waiting in the living room. He'd changed into a tailored charcoal suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine. His eyes swept over her and something flickered in their depths before his professional's mask slammed back into place. He told her she looked perfect. She said she felt like a fraud. He replied that was good. It meant she was paying attention. He offered his arm and said, "Let's go convince the world we're in love." The car ride to Lower Manhattan took 40 minutes. Marcus drove while another guard, a stone-faced man named Tony, sat in the passenger seat. Elena watched the city pass by through tinted windows and tried to calm her racing heart. She asked where exactly they were going. He told her they were going to Russo's, a restaurant in Little Italy owned by an associate of his. Adrian's hand rested on the seat between them, close enough that she could feel its warmth. He explained that Carlos Santino was having lunch there with several other business partners. They were going to join them, show that his marriage was stable, his life was stable, and the rumors about financial problems were baseless. He added that if they didn't believe them, they would, because they were going to give the performance of their lives. The restaurant was tucked into a side street, unassuming from the outside, but elegant within. Red leather booths, white tablecloths, the smell of garlic and wine. A hostess greeted Adrian with a familiarity that suggested he was a regular. She told him his party was in the back room. Adrian's hand settled on Elena's lower back, warm through the thin silk of her dress. To anyone watching, it would look possessive, affectionate. Only Elena felt the tension in his fingers. The back room held a large table where 4 men sat with wine and antipasti. They looked up as Adrian and Elena entered, and Elena felt the weight of their assessment like a physical thing. The man at the head of the table stood. He was in his 60s, gray-haired and distinguished, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He said they weren't expecting Adrian. Adrian called him Carlo and said he heard he was asking questions about his finances. He pulled out a chair for Elena and said he thought he'd answer them in person. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Elena sat, hyper-aware of every eye on her. Adrian took the seat beside her, his thigh pressing against hers under the table. Carlos said carefully that they were concerned, that there were rumors of missing money, theft from within his organization. Adrian's voice was cold and absolute, as he said the rumors were started by his former financial manager, who was now dead because he tried to steal from him. He said the situation had been handled, and the money was being recovered along with evidence of Thomas Brennan's betrayal. Adrian poured wine for himself and water for Elena. The small gesture of remembering she wasn't drinking made something flutter in her chest. He declared his organization was stronger than ever, that the theft was an anomaly, not a systemic problem. One of the other men leaned forward and said they heard he tried to frame someone, his wife. Every eye turned to Elena. She felt like a deer in headlights, frozen and exposed. Adrian's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. He explained that Thomas created false evidence to cover his tracks, thinking that framing Elena would distract from his own crimes. He was wrong. The question came from a younger man, dark-haired and suspicious, asking if he was certain she had nothing to do with it. Elena felt Adrian tense beside her. Before he could respond, she spoke. Her voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her. She said she was a hospital aide who married Adrian 6 months ago because she was drowning in medical debt. She didn't know anything about his business beyond what she saw at public events. She couldn't steal $15 million if she tried. She didn't have the skills, the access, or frankly the imagination for that kind of crime. There was silence. Then Carlo laughed, a deep rumbling sound. He said she was honest, and he liked that. Adrian's hand tightened on hers as he said she was his, and anyone who comes after her comes after him. The message was clear. Elena was under his protection, untouchable. The meeting continued for another hour. Business was discussed, things like shipments and territories and deals Elena didn't fully understand. She played her part perfectly, the devoted wife who smiled and stayed quiet and let the men talk. But she watched, she listened, and she learned. These men were dangerous. They operated in shadows, made fortunes from activities that would send normal people to prison, and Adrian moved among them like a king among lords, respected and feared in equal measure. When they finally left, Elena's head was pounding. She stayed silent in the car until they were safely back in the penthouse. As they rode the elevator up, Adrian said she did well today, that Carlo was impressed. She replied that she didn't care about impressing his criminal friends. He corrected her, saying they weren't his friends, they were business associates. He loosened his tie and said, impressing them keeps her safe. Elena kicked off her heels the moment they entered the penthouse. She asked how long she had to keep doing this, playing dress up, attending meetings, pretending to be something she's not. He said as long as it takes. She said that wasn't an answer. He said it was the only one he had. Adrian poured himself a whiskey. He asked if she wanted the real truth. She said always. He confessed he didn't know how long this would take. He didn't know who killed Thomas or who had the evidence he created. He didn't know if this threat would last weeks or months or years. He downed the whiskey in one swallow. All he knew was that while it exists, she stays close to him. She stays protected. She stays alive. The raw honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Elena sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. She hated this, hated feeling helpless. He said he knew. He sat beside her, careful to maintain distance. He added that for what it's worth, she was handling it better than most people would. She replied that most people haven't spent the last 2 years fighting to survive. He agreed they hadn't. He studied her with those dark, penetrating eyes. He asked her to tell him about her family. What happened? He knew the basics from the background check, but he wanted to hear it from her. Elena hesitated. They'd spent 6 months in a fake marriage without ever having a real conversation. Sharing her pain felt intimate, dangerous. But maybe that's what she needed, to see him as a person instead of just a threat. She began slowly, saying her father was a contractor. Strong, stubborn, the kind of man who thought he could fix anything with his hands. When he got sick, he tried to hide it, kept working until he physically couldn't anymore. The memories still hurt like fresh bruises. By the time they got him to a doctor, the cancer had spread everywhere. Stage 4 pancreatic, a death sentence. Adrian listened without interrupting. The treatments were brutal. Chemo, radiation, explosive drugs that cost a fortune and bought him maybe an extra month. She'd dropped out of nursing school to take care of him. But it wasn't enough. Elena's voice cracked. Nothing was enough. He died 8 months after diagnosis, and all they had to show for it was debt they could never repay. And her mother had a stroke 3 months later. The stresses? The grief. It broke something in her brain. Now she was in a care facility that cost $4,000 a month, and she barely remembers who she is half the time. Elena wiped at her eyes angrily. So yeah, when someone offered her $250,000 to play pretend wife for 6 months, she took it. She wasn't proud of it, but she wasn't ashamed either. She did what she had to do to survive. Adrian's voice was soft as he told her there's no shame in survival, that he would have done the same thing. She asked if he would have found some other way, some criminal shortcut. He smiled without humor. He asked if she thought his choices were so different from hers, if she thought he wanted this life. He answered for her, saying he didn't. He said that was a story for another time. They sat in silence, two damaged people bound by circumstances neither had chosen. Elena felt the weight of her secret pressing down again. She should tell him about the baby. It was the right thing to do. But before she could find the words, Adrian's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression went deadly. It was James. Something was wrong, he answered, telling James to talk to him. Elena couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Adrian's face change, concern bleeding into cold fury. After a pause, he asked how many. Another pause. He ordered to lock it down, full security protocol, and said he was on his way. He ended the call and was already moving toward the bedroom. He told her to stay there, not to open the door for anyone except Marcus. She asked what happened. He explained that someone tried to breach the building's security. They didn't get in. But James found surveillance equipment in the parking garage. Adrian was pulling on a shoulder holster, checking a gun with practiced efficiency. Someone had been watching the penthouse, watching her. Fear turned Elena's blood to ice. They knew she was here. He said yes. He grabbed a jacket, which meant they were planning something. He needed to coordinate with his security team, set up countermeasures. She said she was coming with him. He said absolutely not, that she was staying here where it's safe. She questioned how it was safe if someone had been watching the place. He explained that the penthouse was a fortress with bulletproof glass, reinforced doors, and a panic room if needed. He moved close, gripping her shoulders. He knew she hated feeling trapped, but right now this was the safest place in the city. He asked her to trust him. She said she didn't trust him, that she barely knew him. Something painful flickered in his eyes. He said then she should trust that he was very good at keeping what was his alive. He left before she could respond. Marcus appeared moments later, taking up position outside her door. Elena paced the penthouse like a caged animal, her mind racing. Someone was watching, planning, moving against her while Adrian scrambled to protect her, and she was stuck here, helpless, waiting for the next crisis. Her hand moved to her stomach again. How long before she couldn't hide this? How long before Adrian figured out that she was carrying his child? The afternoon dragged into evening. Marcus brought her food she couldn't eat. The sun set over the Hudson, painting the sky in shades of fire. And still Adrian didn't return. Elena tried to sleep but couldn't. Every sound made her jump. She kept checking her phone, hoping for updates that never came. At midnight, she heard the elevator, footsteps in the hallway, the door opening. Adrian looked exhausted. His tie was gone, his shirt wrinkled, stubble darkening his jaw, but he was unhurt. She asked if he was okay before she could stop herself. He seemed surprised by the question. He said he was fine. They had secured the building, found and removed all the surveillance equipment, and reviewed security footage, but couldn't identify who planted it, so they were still out there. He said yes. He poured himself a whiskey with shaking hands, the first sign of weakness she'd seen from him, but he swore on his life they wouldn't get to her. The ferocity in his voice made her breath catch. This wasn't just about protection or business or maintaining appearances. This was personal. She asked why he cared so much. She was just a woman he hired to play a role. Adrian downed his whiskey, set down the glass, and finally looked at her. Really looked at her. His voice was rough and raw as he said that night 3 months ago when they forgot to be strangers. That wasn't a mistake for him. That was the first real thing he'd felt in years. And he'd been trying to stay away from her ever since, because he knew. He knew that caring about her would make her a target, that his feelings would put her in danger. Elena's heart was hammering, so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. He moved closer, and she could see the anguish in his eyes. He had tried to keep his distance, tried to maintain boundaries, tried to treat this like the business arrangement it was supposed to be. But he couldn't anymore, not when someone was threatening her, not when he might lose her before he ever really had her. She said this was crazy, that they didn't know each other. He said he knew she was brave even when she was terrified. He knew she sacrificed everything for her family. He knew she hated being helpless and would rather fight than hide. He reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with unexpected gentleness. He knew that when she really smiled, not the fake one she used at events, it made his chest ache, and he knew he had no right to feel this way, but he did. Elena should step back, should establish boundaries, protect herself. But she was so tired of being alone, so tired of being afraid. And the truth was that she'd felt it, too. That spark between them. That connection she'd tried so hard to ignore. The words fell out before she could stop them. She was pregnant. Adrian froze. She repeated that she was pregnant with his child from that night. She'd found out yesterday. She was going to tell him. But everything happened so fast, and she didn't know how he'd react, and she was scared. He kissed her. Not gentle, not tentative, but desperate and claiming, his hands cupping her face like she was precious, irreplaceable. Elena gasped against his mouth, and he took advantage, deepening the kiss until she couldn't think, couldn't breathe, could only feel. When he finally pulled back, they were both shaking. He said it again, like testing the words, that she was pregnant. Yes, with his baby. Yes. A smile broke across his face, genuine and transformative. And she was going to hide that from him? She didn't know if he'd want it, or them. He pressed his forehead to hers. He wanted everything. Her, the baby, a real marriage. Not a contract, not an arrangement. Real. She said that was insane, that people don't build relationships like this. He said people like them do. His hands moved to her waist, protective and possessive. They started backwards, and they would figure out the rest as they go. Elena knew she should be more cautious, should think this through. But standing in his arms, feeling safe for the first time in months, she couldn't make herself care about logic. She was still angry at him for making decisions without asking her. He knew. And she still wanted her own security team and privacy. He said she would have it, and she wasn't giving up her life completely. She needed to see her mother maintain some independence. He said they would work it out. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. They would figure it all out together. Together. The word felt foreign and perfect all at once. They stood wrapped in each other as the city glittered beyond the windows. Two broken people finding something whole in the wreckage of their lives. Elena knew the danger hadn't passed. knew that someone still wanted her dead. That threat still lurked in shadows. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't facing it alone. Adrian pulled back slightly, his hand moving to her stomach with wonder. He asked how far along. She said about 8 weeks. He asked when she started feeling sick. She said 3 weeks ago she'd thought it was stress. He laughed quietly. They really did this backwards. Then his expression turned serious. This changed everything. The security, the threat level. They couldn't know about the baby. If word got out, she knew she'd be an even bigger target. He said it wasn't just that. His jaw tightened. A child makes her permanent, makes them permanent. Some of his enemies would see that as weakness to exploit. The reality settled over them like a weight. Their moment of honesty, of connection, was already being swallowed by the dangers of his world. Adrian said fiercely that he wouldn't let anything happen to either of them. Whatever it took, however long this lasts, they were both under his protection now. Elena wanted to argue that she wasn't his to protect, that she could take care of herself. But the truth was, she needed him, needed his resources, his power, his ruthless determination to keep her alive. She said okay, they'd do this together. He agreed. They moved to the couch, and Elena found herself curled against his side, his arm around her shoulders. It felt natural, in a way nothing between them ever had before. She asked him about his family. He'd said he didn't have any, but everyone comes from somewhere. Adrian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he told her his father was a small-time enforcer for the Moretti family. Violent, drunk, mean. He beat his mother until she was too broken to fight back. When he was 10, his father went too far and put her in the hospital. She died 3 days later. The Morettis took him in after that, raised him, trained him, made him what he is. His voice was flat, emotionless. He worked his way up through their organization, proved himself valuable. When the old boss died, he took over his territory, built his own operation from the ground up. She asked if he regretted it, this life. He said every day. He pulled her closer. But regret doesn't change the past. All they can do is try to build something better going forward. She asked if that was what they were doing, building something better. He said he hoped so. They sat in comfortable silence, both processing the magnitude of what had just shifted between them. Outside, the city never slept. Inside, two people who had started as strangers began the complicated work of becoming something more. Elena's eyes were growing heavy when Adrian spoke again. He said they should sleep. Tomorrow, they would start planning real security measures, and she needed to see a doctor to make sure the pregnancy was progressing normally. She noted she couldn't exactly go to her regular doctor. He said he had a doctor on retainer who was completely discreet. He helped her stand and told both of them to rest for now. At her bedroom door, Elena hesitated. She thanked him for telling her the truth tonight about everything. He said they were past pretending. From now on, only truth between them. She kissed him goodnight, soft and lingering, and retreated to her room. As she settled into bed, one hand on her stomach, Elena realized that everything had changed in the span of a single conversation. She wasn't alone anymore, wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She had Adrian now, with all the complications and dangers that entailed, and growing inside her was a child who would bind them together forever. The future was terrifying and uncertain, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena felt something that might have been hope. In his own room, Adrian stared at the ceiling and tried to process the bomb Elena had dropped. A baby. His baby. The one thing he'd never imagined having, the one piece of normal life he'd thought forever beyond his reach. And now someone was threatening her. Threatening them both. Threatening his child. The cold fury that thought sparked was unlike anything Adrian had ever felt. He'd killed before, would kill again if necessary. But this was different. This wasn't business or territory or reputation. This was family. His phone buzzed with an update from James. They'd traced the surveillance equipment to a supplier in Queens and were working on identifying who'd purchased it. Progress, but not enough. Not fast enough. Adrian pulled up the files on Thomas Brennan again, searching for something he'd missed. A connection. A clue. Anything that would lead him to whoever was behind this. Because he'd meant what he said to Elena. He would protect her and their child by any means necessary. He would burn the whole city down if that's what it took. The game had changed. The stakes had never been higher, and Adrian De Lorenzo had never been more dangerous than when protecting what was his. The doctor arrived at 10 the next morning, A composed woman in her 50s named Dr. Sarah Chen, who carried a medical bag and asked no questions beyond the clinical ones. Elena sat on the edge of Adrian's guest bed while portable ultrasound equipment was set up, acutely aware of Adrian standing by the window, tension radiating from every line of his body. Dr. Chen said everything looked good as she moved the wand across Elena's abdomen. Based on measurements, she'd say she was about 9 weeks along, with a due date in late June. June? Elena stared at the grainy image on the screen, at the tiny, flickering heartbeat that seemed impossibly fast. That was her baby, their baby, real and growing and completely dependent on her survival. Dr. Chen continued, saying the nausea should start easing in the next few weeks. She was prescribing prenatal vitamins and ginger supplements, and recommended small meals throughout the day and staying hydrated. Adrian moved closer, his eyes fixed on the monitor. He asked if she was at a higher risk, given the stress of the situation. The doctor replied that stress isn't ideal, but Elena is young and healthy. As long as she takes care of herself, there was no reason to expect complications. Dr. Chen printed several ultrasound images and said she'd like to see her again in 4 weeks, or sooner if there was any bleeding or severe pain. When the doctor left, Elena held one of the ultrasound photos with shaking hands. This was real. This was actually happening. Adrian sat beside her, taking the photo gently. They were having a baby. The wonder in his voice made her throat tight. For all his danger and darkness, in this moment, he looked almost vulnerable, like he couldn't quite believe something this good could happen to him. Elena said they needed to talk about what comes next. Not just security, everything. Where she'll live long term, how they'll co-parent if this doesn't work out between them. He interrupted, saying it was going to work out. He set the photo aside and took her hands. He knew it was fast, knew they were doing everything backwards, but he meant what he said last night. He wanted this. All of it. She said he says that now, but what happens when the initial excitement wears off? When reality sets in and he remembers that he never wanted to be tied down. He waited until she met his eyes. He'd spent 15 years building walls, keeping people at a distance, telling himself that attachment was weakness. And maybe it is. Maybe caring about her, and this baby makes him vulnerable in ways he can't afford. His grip tightened, but he didn't care anymore. She was worth the risk. Before she could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at it and his expression hardened. It was James. He needed to take it. He stepped into the hallway, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the ultrasound photo. She traced the tiny shape with one finger, marveling at how something so small could change everything so completely. Adrian's voice drifted through the door, too low to make out words, but sharp with tension. When he returned, his face was grim. They had a problem. James had traced the surveillance equipment to a shell company owned by Paolo Russo. The name meant nothing to Elena. He was the brother of Vincent Russo, one of Thomas Brennan's associates. Adrian began pacing. Vincent was found dead 2 days ago, shot in an apparent home invasion, but it wasn't random. Someone executed him. She thought it was connected to Thomas's death. He knew it was. Vincent and Thomas were working together on something, and now they're both dead, and Vincent's brother is watching the penthouse. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. Paolo Russo was a hothead, violent, unpredictable. If he thinks he killed his brother, she asked if he did. Adrian stopped pacing and looked at her directly. No, he'd had Vincent under surveillance because he suspected he was involved in the theft, but he didn't order his death. Someone was cleaning up loose ends and trying to make it look like he was responsible. To turn Paolo against him. Exactly. And a grieving brother looking for revenge is exactly the kind of weapon someone would use to come after him. He pulled out his phone. He needed to meet with Paolo to try to convince him he wasn't his enemy. She said that sounded incredibly dangerous. He replied that everything about his life is dangerous. He was already texting someone, but if he could turn him, find out what Vincent knew before he died, maybe they could identify who was really behind this. She asked what would happen if he couldn't turn him, if he'd already decided he was guilty. Adrian's silence was answer enough. Elena stood, fear coiling in her stomach. She didn't want him going into a meeting with someone who might want him dead. He said it wasn't her choice. She shot back. The hell it wasn't. He just told her they were in this together, that he wanted a real relationship. That meant she got a say in whether he walked into obvious traps. Something softened in his expression. He said she was right, and he was sorry. But this was the only lead they had. If Paolo could tell him what Vincent knew, who he was afraid of, it might break this whole thing open, or it might get him killed. He said he'd take every precaution. A neutral location, multiple guards, weapons. He wasn't going in blind. Elena wanted to argue more, wanted to lock him in the penthouse where he'd be safe. But she could see the determination in his eyes. This was who he was. A man who faced threats head-on, who fought instead of hiding. She said fine, quietly, but she had a condition. He told her to name it. She said he had to take Marcus and at least 3 other guards, wear a vest, and keep his phone on the entire time so she could hear what's happening. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Deal. He spent the next hour coordinating with James, choosing the location, a warehouse in Red Hook that his organization owned, and arranging security. Elena watched him work, saw the cold competence that had built his empire. This was Adrian in his element, strategic and ruthless. But when he kissed her goodbye at the door, all she saw was the man who'd looked at their baby's ultrasound with wonder. She whispered for him to be careful. He always was. He pressed his forehead to hers. Rebecca would be there in 20 minutes. He told her not to open the door for anyone else. Then he was gone, and Elena was alone, with Marcus standing guard and fear eating through her chest like acid. Rebecca Santos arrived exactly on time, a compact woman in her 40s with shrewd eyes and the controlled movements of someone trained in combat. She swept the penthouse methodically before introducing herself. She'd read the briefing, she said, shaking Elena's hand. Someone had made her a target, and her job was to make sure they failed. Elena asked if she'd worked for Adrian before. Rebecca said on and off for 3 years. He's demanding but fair, pays well, and doesn't ask his people to take unnecessary risks. Rebecca settled into sightlines to both the elevator and the windows. She told Elena she was in good hands. Elena wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that Adrian's security was as good as he claimed, but the fear wouldn't let go. She pulled out her phone and opened the call Adrian had initiated before leaving. She could hear car sounds, muffled conversation, the rumble of the engine. Adrian's voice came through slightly distorted, asking if she could hear him. She said yes. He said they were 10 minutes out and Paolo had agreed to meet. He noted that was either very good or very bad. She said she was voting for good. He chuckled, calling her an optimist. The call went quiet, except for ambient noise. Elena paced the penthouse, unable to sit still. Rebecca watched her with professional calm, but didn't comment. Finally, Adrian's voice. They were there. The warehouse looked clear from outside. Marcus and the team were doing a sweep now. Elena's heart hammered. She heard car doors opening, footsteps on concrete, echoing in the vast space of the warehouse. Marcus's voice reported it was clear, with no signs of ambush. Adrian's footsteps continued as he called out for Paolo. A new voice, younger and rougher than Adrian's, said he was there. Elena held her breath as furniture scraped, chairs being positioned. Then silence as the 2 men sat across from each other, each probably taking the other's measure. Adrian thanked him for meeting. Paolo's voice dripped with hostility as he said he didn't have much choice, that Adrian had made it clear this was important. He told him to talk, to tell him why he shouldn't put a bullet in his head for what he did to Vincent. Adrian calmly said he didn't kill his brother. Paolo accused him, saying Vincent worked for him, stole from him, and he found out and had him executed. Adrian explained that Vincent did steal from him, along with Thomas Brennan, but he didn't kill either of them. Someone was playing them against each other, someone who benefits from them being at war. Paolo asked who. Adrian said he didn't know yet. That's what he was trying to find out. There was silence. Then Paolo laughed bitterly. He asked if Adrian expected him to believe that. He was Adrian De Lorenzo. He knew everything that happens in his organization. The edge in Adrian's voice sharpened as he said clearly not, since $15 million went missing without his knowledge. He told Paolo his brother betrayed him, but he was also scared. In the weeks before he died, Vincent was acting paranoid, looking over his shoulder. He asked who Vincent was afraid of. Paolo said how should he know, that Vincent didn't exactly share his criminal activities with his baby brother. But he knew he was involved in something, knew he was working with Thomas Brennan. More silence. Elena could picture them, 2 dangerous men circling each other verbally, each looking for weakness. Paolo finally said Vincent called him the night before he died. He told him if anything happened to him, he should know it wasn't an accident, that someone was cleaning house. Adrian asked if he said who. Paulo said no, he was too scared. He said knowing the name would put him in danger too. Paulo's voice cracked slightly. The next morning, cops found him dead in his apartment. 2 shots to the head, a professional hit, and he assumed Adrian ordered it. He asked who else would want him dead. Adrian pointed out it would be whoever Vincent was afraid of, whoever was behind the theft and framing Elena. He told Paulo to think about it. If he wanted Vincent dead, why would he make it look like a home invasion? Why not just make him disappear like he does with people who really cross him? The logic was sound, and Elena could hear Paulo processing it. Paulo asked if someone framed his wife. Thomas created false evidence, making it look like Elena stole the money. When he died, that evidence went to whoever killed him. Now they could use it to paint him as either a fool who married a thief or a victim seeking revenge. He knew Vincent was killed by the same person. The question was why. What did Vincent know that made him dangerous? Paulo was quiet for a long moment. There was something. Vincent mentioned it once when he was drunk. He said Thomas had found out about a deal, something big that would change everything. But Vincent wouldn't give details. Adrian pressed, asking what kind of deal. Paulo had no idea, but he was excited about it. He said they'd finally have enough money to get out, to start fresh somewhere the families couldn't reach them. Elena's mind raced, a deal big enough to steal $15 million, big enough to kill for. Adrian asked if Vincent kept records, files, documents, anything that might explain what they were into. Paulo said if he did, the cops took it all when they searched his apartment. Adrian said cops don't look that carefully at home. Invasion's gone wrong. There might be something they missed. His chair scraped. He needed access to Vincent's place. Paulo said it was still a crime scene. Adrian asked since, when that's stopped people like them. Paulo laughed without humor. He said Adrian had balls, he'd give him that. Coming to him claiming innocence, then asking him to help break into his dead brother's apartment. Adrian said he was asking for help to find who really killed him. Didn't he want justice for Vincent? Paulo spat the word justice like poison. He and Vincent grew up watching their father get screwed by people like Adrian. Powerful men who took what they wanted and left guys like them to pick up the pieces. So no, he didn't give a damn about his version of justice. The temperature in the conversation dropped 20 degrees. Elena's hands clenched around her phone. Adrian's voice was dangerously soft as he asked what he wanted then. Paulo said he wanted the truth. He wanted to know who killed his brother and why. And if it really wasn't him, then he wanted to help destroy whoever it was. Elena released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Adrian said they had a deal, on one condition. He wanted to meet the wife, the one supposedly framed for the theft. Adrian's refusal was immediate and absolute. He said she wasn't part of this. Paulo argued she was the center of it. If someone really went through the trouble of framing her, he wanted to know why. He wanted to see if she was the innocent victim he claimed, or something else entirely. Adrian repeated that it wasn't happening. Paulo stood, saying they were done here. If Adrian wanted his help, he had to give him access to the woman at the heart of this whole mess. Otherwise, he'd go back to assuming he was lying and start planning his funeral. The silence stretched taut as wire. Adrian finally said he'd ask her, but the decision was hers. Paulo said that was fair enough and gave him 24 hours. Footsteps echoed as Paulo left. More silence. Then Adrian's voice, quiet and strained, asked if she heard all that. Elena said every word. He said she didn't have to meet him, that he could find another way. Elena thought about the baby growing inside her, about the unknown enemy circling them, about the fact that every moment this threat existed was a moment she and her child were in danger. She said no. If meeting her helped convince him Adrian was innocent, helped them find who was really behind this, then she'd do it. He reminded her they were in this together, and that meant she didn't hide while he took all the risks. She took a steadying breath and told him to set up the meeting, but she wanted Rebecca with her the entire time. He agreed. Relief flooded his voice. He was coming home. They would plan this carefully, make sure she was protected. The call ended. Elena sat down the phone and found Rebecca watching her with new respect. The security guard said she nuts. That meeting Paulo Russo was no joke. The kid had a temper and a body count. He was bad enough that even Adrian's people gave him space. He wasn't part of any organization, worked freelance, which made him unpredictable. Rebecca checked her weapon, a habitual gesture. But if anyone could handle him, it was her husband. My husband? The word still felt strange, but less like a lie than they had a week ago. Adrian returned an hour later, sweeping into the penthouse with Marcus and two other guards. He went straight to Elena, cupping her face and searching her eyes. He asked if she was sure about this. She said no, but she was doing it anyway. He kissed her hard and possessive. When he pulled back, his eyes were fierce. He swore nothing would happen to her. He didn't care what it took, what he had to do. She and their baby would come out of this safe. She said they would, all three of them. They spent the afternoon planning. The meeting would take place at a restaurant in Brooklyn. Public enough to discourage violence, but private enough for real conversation. Rebecca and Marcus would be at the next table, armed and ready. Adrian would be across from her, and James would have men positioned outside. Adrian said Paolo was bringing his own security, two ex-military guys who would be armed. Elena noted that everyone would be armed except her. He handed her a small device that looked like a car key fob, a panic button. If she pressed it, every guard in the building would converge on their location in seconds. Elena turned the device over in her hands. Her life had become something out of a thriller movie. Panic buttons and armed guards and meetings with dangerous men. 6 months ago, her biggest worry had been picking up enough shifts to make rent. She said quietly that she hated this, that she hated that their baby was going to be born into this world, surrounded by violence and danger. Adrian pulled her close, his hand settling protectively over her stomach. He promised it wouldn't always be like this. Once they identified the threat and eliminated it, things would be different, safer. She asked if they would, or if this was just his normal, and she needed to accept that. The question hung between them, heavy, with implications about their future. He admitted he didn't know. He'd been in this life so long, he wasn't sure what normal looked like anymore. But he wanted to try for her, for their child. He wanted to build something better than what he'd had. She said that was going to require real change, not just promises. He knew. He kissed her forehead, one crisis at a time. First, they survive this. Then, they figure out how to live. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one hand on her stomach, feeling the weight of tomorrow's meeting pressing down. What if Paolo saw through her? What if he decided she was lying, that she really was involved in the theft? What if he decided to hurt her to get to Adrian? Around 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and padded to the kitchen for water. She found Adrian at the dining table, surrounded by papers and files, his laptop open. She asked if he couldn't sleep either. He looked up, dark circles under his eyes. He was trying to find the connection. There was something he was missing, some piece that tied this all together. Aslena sat beside him, looking at the documents. She told him to walk her through it, that sometimes fresh eyes help. Adrian hesitated, then began laying out the timeline. Thomas Brennan had started stealing about 2 years ago, small amounts at first that gradually increased. Vincent Russo had joined him about 6 months later. Together, they'd siphoned $15 million through a complex web of shell companies. But Adrian said what didn't make sense, pointing to a spreadsheet, was that the money didn't stay in their accounts. It was moved again, transferred to offshore holdings that neither Thomas nor Vincent controlled, so someone else was pulling the strings. Exactly. Thomas and Vincent were middlemen, probably taking a cut, but not controlling the operation. He pulled up another document, and then there was the timing. Thomas dies, and 3 days later Vincent dies. Both executed professionally. That's not a coincidence. Whoever was really behind the theft killed them to cover their tracks, right? Adrian wondered why now. They'd been stealing for 2 years. Why suddenly clean house? Elena thought about it. Maybe because he discovered the theft. Maybe Thomas panicked and told whoever was really in charge, and that person decided to eliminate the liability. Adrian stared at her. That would mean someone knew he'd found out about the theft before he even confronted Thomas. He wondered if that was possible, if he could have a leak in his organization. His expression darkened. He'd been so focused on external threats, he didn't consider internal ones. But yeah, it was possible. Someone close enough to know his business, to know when he discovered the theft. He asked who had that kind of access, his inner circle. James, Marcus, his accountant, his attorney. He stood, began pacing. But he'd known these people for years. He trusted them with his life. Elena suggested that maybe that's why he hadn't seen it, because he trusted them. The idea clearly disturbed him. Adrian had built his organization on loyalty, on bonds forged through shared danger and mutual benefit. The thought that someone inside his circle could betray him struck at the foundation of everything he'd created. He said he needed to audit everyone. Financial records, communications, movements. If there was a traitor, he'd find them. She asked what would happen then. His eyes were cold as winter. Then he'd deal with them the way he deals with all betrayals. Elena shivered at the ice in his voice. This was the Adrian that enemies feared. Ruthless, unforgiving, deadly. She'd known intellectually that he'd killed people, that his hands weren't clean, but seeing that coldness directed at the possibility of betrayal made it visceral and real. She stood and moved to him. She told him not to lose himself in the darkness, that they needed him focused, not consumed by revenge. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Sometimes the darkness is all he knew. She said then she'd be his light. They'd be his light. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. This baby deserves a father, who's more than just anger and violence. Adrian's hand spread over her stomach, protective and gentle. He said she was right. He knew she was right. It was just the thought that someone he trusted could do this, could put her in danger. She knew, but they would figure it out together. They'd find the truth, and they'd handle it the right way. He nodded against her hair. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other before exhaustion finally drove them both to bed. The next morning arrived too quickly. Elena dressed for the meeting with Paolo. Nice jeans, a soft sweater that hid her slightly thickening waist, minimal jewelry. She wanted to look approachable, honest, not like someone who'd steal millions. Rebecca arrived at noon, dressed in dark slacks and a blazer that concealed her weapon. She walked Elena through final safety protocols, showing her hand signals and exit routes, drilling her on what to do if things went wrong. Rebecca instructed her to stay calm, answer questions honestly, and keep her hands visible at all times. Paolo would be watching for tells, signs she was lying. She just had to be herself and she'd be fine. And if she wasn't fine, Rebecca said, then she'd put 3 rounds in his chest before he could touch her. The matter-of-fact delivery should have been disturbing. Instead, Elena found it oddly comforting. The drive to Brooklyn took 40 minutes through midday traffic. Adrian sat beside her, hand clasped with hers, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Marcus drove while Rebecca sat in the passenger seat, both guards alert for threats. The restaurant was a small Italian place tucked into a residential street. They arrived early, and James's team swept it thoroughly before giving the all-clear. Adrian escorted Elena inside, his hand on her lower back, eyes scanning constantly. Paolo Russo was already there, sitting at a corner table with clear sightlines to the door. He was younger than Elena expected, maybe 25, with dark hair and his brother's eyes. 2 large men flanked him, their jackets bulging with poorly concealed weapons. Adrian greeted him with a carefully neutral tone and thanked him for meeting. Paolo said he didn't think he'd actually bring her. His gaze locked on Elena, assessing and cold. He asked if she was the woman worth all this trouble. Elena lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. She was the woman who got framed for a crime she didn't commit. If that made her trouble, so be it. A flicker of surprise crossed Paolo's face. He gestured to the chairs across from him. Sit, let's talk. They settled into a tense tableau. Adrian and Elena on one side, Paolo on the other, guards from both parties watching each other like predators. A waiter appeared, took drink orders with trembling hands, and fled. Paolo asked Elena to tell him about herself, how a woman like her ends up married to someone like De Lorenzo. Elena kept her voice level as she said desperation and bad choices. Her father died of cancer, left her family in debt. Adrian offered her a way out. 6 months of playing his wife in public, and she'd have enough money to take care of her mother and start over. Paolo asked if it was a business arrangement. She said yes, but she was still here, even though 6 months was up. Elena glanced at Adrian before answering. The arrangement got complicated. Someone made her a target, and Adrian's protection became the only thing keeping her alive. Paolo leaned back, convenient from Adrian's perspective, to keep her close, under his control. Elena said sharply that she wasn't under anyone's control. She was here because she wanted the same thing he did, to find who killed Thomas and Vincent and why they framed her for their crimes. Paolo studied her for a long moment. He asked if she really didn't know anything about the theft. She said she didn't even know what Adrian did for a living until after they were married. She was a hospital aide trying to survive. She didn't have the skills or knowledge to steal $15 million from anyone, let alone from an organization like his. Paolo suggested she could have been a pawn, someone manipulating her without her knowledge. The thought chilled her. How? Identity theft, forged documents, using her information without her permission. Paolo pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. He'd done some digging after their meeting yesterday and found some interesting things. Elena opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were bank statements showing an account in her name, one she'd never opened. Transfers, deposits, withdrawals, all documented with her signature. She breathed that this wasn't real, that she never signed these. Paolo said the signatures match her DMV records and her social security number was correct. As far as any investigator would be concerned, this was her account. Adrian took the documents, his jaw tight with fury. This was what Thomas created, the false trail. Paolo suggested that maybe it was real and she was playing them both. His eyes never left Elena's face. He needed to know which it was. Elena said forcefully that it was fake. She'd never seen these accounts before in her life. She didn't even know what bank this was, Metropolitan Savings and Trust. A small private bank in Queens that caters to people who want discretion. She'd never been to Queens except to visit her mother's care facility. Paolo had pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. It was surveillance footage from the bank 3 months ago. He asked her to tell him that wasn't her. Elena stared at the image. The woman in the photo had her face, her build, her hair. She wore a business suit Elena had never owned and carried a briefcase she'd never touched. But the resemblance was uncanny. She whispered that it wasn't her. She swore it wasn't her. Paolo asked how she could be sure. Maybe she forgot. She said she was working double shifts 3 months ago, picking up every hour she could get, because her mother's facility raised their rates. Desperation crept into her voice. She told him to check her employment records. She was at the hospital from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. most days. She couldn't have been at a bank in Queens. Adrian was already on his phone with James, asking for her employment records from the hospital, specifically for the week of August 15th. He told him to pull security footage from the hospital if he could. He ended the call and looked at Paolo. He said they'd have proof within the hour. Paolo retorted that he'd have doctored records proving whatever story he wanted to tell. Adrian told him to send his own people to verify, to call the hospital himself, to do whatever he needed to satisfy himself that Elena was telling the truth. The tension at the table could have been cut with a knife. Elena felt Paolo's scrutiny like a physical weight, saw the calculation in his eyes as he decided whether to believe them. Finally, he nodded slowly. Okay. He said, let's say he believes the woman in that photo isn't really her. That means someone went through considerable effort to make it look like her. Why? Adrian said it was to frame her when the theft was discovered, to make it seem like he either didn't know his own wife was stealing from me, or that he was covering for her. Either way, it makes him look weak, vulnerable, a perfect target for rivals looking to make a move. Paolo countered that maybe it was exactly what it looked like, and they were both lying to cover up the fact that they got caught. Adrian's voice hardened. If that were true, why would he meet with him at all? Why not just eliminate him like he thinks he eliminated Vincent? Paolo said he wasn't stupid enough to come to this meeting without insurance. If he didn't walk out of there alive, files would get released to every major organization on the East Coast. Files that detail everything Vincent told him about his operation, about the theft, about all of it. Adrian smiled without warmth. Then they were at a stalemate. Paolo couldn't move against him without consequences, and he couldn't move against Paolo without painting a target on his back. He guessed that meant they were going to have to actually trust each other. Paolo didn't sound happy about it. Fine. They'd work together to find who really killed Thomas and Vincent. They'd find out who framed his wife, and when they did, they'd split the $15 million and go their separate ways. Adrian told him to keep the money. He just wanted the people responsible. Something shifted in Paolo's expression. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. He asked if Adrian would really give up $15 million for revenge. Adrian corrected him, for justice, and to protect his family. Paolo's gaze flicked to Elena, seeing her with new eyes. There was more to this than a business arrangement, wasn't there? Elena took Adrian's hand, felt his fingers interlock with hers. Yes, there was. Paolo said, congratulations, they'd managed to make this even more complicated. Paolo pulled out a flash drive and tossed it on the table. It was copies of everything he found in Vincent's apartment before the cops sealed it. Financial records, emails, some encrypted files he hadn't been able to crack. Maybe his people could make sense of it. Adrian pocketed the drive and thanked him. Paulo told him not to thank him yet. If this led nowhere, if he found out he'd been playing him, their deal was off and they were back to being enemies. Adrian understood. They parted ways with wary nods, neither side trusting the other, but both bound by necessity. In the car, Elena finally allowed herself to shake, the reaction setting in. She said that was terrifying. Adrian said she was perfect, calm, honest, exactly what they needed. She noted that he still didn't trust them. Adrian said no, but he was willing to work with them, which was more than he'd hoped for. Back at the penthouse, James was already analyzing the contents of the flash drive. He'd set up multiple monitors in Adrian's office, data scrolling across screens in a cascade of information. James said without preamble that most of it was standard finance records, but there was one encrypted file that was different. Military-grade encryption, way beyond what Thomas or Vincent would have access to. Adrian asked if he could crack it. James said given time, maybe, but there was a shortcut. He pulled up a document. He'd found a reference to the file in Vincent's emails. He called it the insurance policy. Whatever was in there, he thought it was valuable enough to keep hidden. Adrian ordered him to keep working on it, priority 1. As James worked, Adrian pulled Elena into the bedroom, closing the door behind them. The stress of the day had carved lines into his face, made him look older than his 32 years. He asked if she was okay, that it had been a lot. She said she was fine, scared but fine. She leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. She asked if he really thought Paulo's information would help. He said he hoped so, because right now it was the only lead they had. They stood together in the quiet of the bedroom, the sounds of the city muted by bulletproof glass. Outside, the sun was setting over the Hudson, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. It should have been beautiful. Instead, all Elena could think about was the danger closing in around them, the unseen enemy moving in shadows. The baby chose that moment to make its presence known. A flutter of movement so faint Elena almost missed it. She gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. Adrian's concern was immediate, asking what was wrong. She said it was nothing. She just thought she felt the baby move. His eyes widened. He placed his hand over hers, waiting. He asked if she was sure. She said no, maybe. It was so small, like a butterfly. She laughed, sudden joy breaking through the fear. Their baby, moving and growing and real. He pulled her into a kiss, tender and fierce. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. He said they were going to survive this. All 3 of them. He swore it. Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love and determination would be enough to overcome the threats surrounding them. But in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that some enemies couldn't be defeated with bullets and guards. Some enemies were patient, subtle, willing to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And somewhere in the city, that enemy was watching, planning, moving pieces into place for a final, devastating move. The encrypted file took James 3 days to crack. 3 days of mounting tension, of Elena feeling like a caged animal, pacing the penthouse, while Adrian coordinated security and chased down leads that went nowhere. 3 days of watching the man she'd married transform from the tender father-to-be who'd marveled at their baby's heartbeat into the cold strategist who made enemies disappear. She saw both sides of him now. She saw him take a call at 2 in the morning and speak in clipped sentences about handling a situation before returning to bed and pulling her close with hands that trembled slightly. She saw him order Marcus to increase patrols around her mother's care facility, then spend 20 minutes on the phone with the facility director, arranging private nurses and upgraded security because Mrs. Vargas deserved the best care available. She saw the darkness and the light warring inside him and wondered which would win. On the 3rd night, James burst into the penthouse at 11 p.m., his normally composed face electric with triumph. He announced that he'd cracked it, the encrypted file. They needed to see this now. They gathered in Adrian's office. Adrian, Elena, James, and Marcus. Rebecca stood by the door, alert for threats. James pulled up the file on the main monitor, and Elena's breath caught. It was a video. Vincent Russo sat in what looked like his apartment, speaking directly to the camera with the nervous energy of a man who knew his life was in danger. He began by saying that if you're watching this, he's probably dead. His voice shook. Thomas was dead too, most likely. They got in over their heads with something they didn't understand, and now they were cleaning up loose ends. Adrian leaned forward, his entire body tense. On screen, Vincent continued. It started 2 years ago when Thomas discovered irregularities in De Lorenzo's accounts. Not theft exactly, but money moving in ways that didn't make sense. He brought him in to help trace it, and that's when they found the real operation. Elena whispered, asking what operation. Vincent said someone inside Adrian's organization had been using his infrastructure to launder money for the Kozlov Bratva. Millions of dollars, maybe tens of millions over the years. They embedded their operation so deep inside his legitimate businesses that even De Lorenzo didn't know it was happening. The room went deadly silent. The Kozlov Bratva, Russian organized crime, ruthless and powerful. Elena had heard enough from Adrian to know they were major players, the kind of enemy that could destroy everything he'd built. Vincent continued, shame evident in his voice. He and Thomas thought they could skim some of the money without anyone noticing. Just enough to get out, start over. But someone figured out what they were doing. Someone high up in De Lorenzo's organization. Someone who's been working with the Bratva all along. Adrian's voice was barely above a growl as he asked who. Vincent leaned closer to the camera. He didn't have proof, but Thomas thought it was someone in the inner circle, someone with access to everything. Finances, security, operations. He was going to confront them the night he died. The video cut to black. Silence filled the office like a physical presence. Adrian said slowly that someone in his inner circle had been using his organization to launder Russian mob money for years. James added that when Thomas discovered it, they killed him and Vincent to protect their operation, then framed Elena to make it look like a simple theft. Marcus shook his head. That was cold. Adrian stood abruptly and began pacing like a caged predator, his inner circle. That was James, Marcus, his attorney, his accountant, his logistics coordinator. He stopped, facing them. One of them had betrayed him. The accusation hung in the air. Marcus and James exchanged glances, both men visibly shaken. James said firmly that it wasn't him. He'd been with Adrian for 8 years, had bled for him, killed for him. He wouldn't betray him. Adrian told him to prove it, to give him access to everything. His finances, his communications, his movements, all of it. James didn't hesitate. He said done. Marcus agreed immediately, whatever he needed to clear them. Adrian studied them both, searching for deception. Elena watched the exchange with a sinking feeling. These were men who'd fought beside Adrian, who'd protected him and served him loyally. If one of them was the traitor, it would destroy him. Elena asked about his accountant or his attorney. David Chen had been his accountant for 6 years. Peter Morrison, his attorney for 10. Adrian resumed pacing. Both had complete access to his financial operations. Both would have the knowledge and ability to hide a laundering scheme. James said they needed to investigate them without tipping anyone off. If the traitor realized they were onto them, they'd either run or strike first. Or both. Adrian pulled out his phone. He was calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow. All senior personnel. He'd say it was about the theft investigation, about clearing Elena's name publicly. Whoever the traitor was, they'd have to attend or risk raising suspicion. Marcus warned it was dangerous, bringing everyone together in one place. Adrian said it was also an opportunity. They'd have eyes on everyone, could monitor their reactions when they presented Vincent's video. Adrian's smile was sharp and cold. Guilty people reveal themselves under pressure. Elena's stomach churned. He was going to show them the video. Wouldn't that put them in more danger? He said they were already in danger. This just forced the traitor's hand. He moved to her, cupped her face gently. He wouldn't let anything happen to her. Tomorrow, she would stay here with Rebecca and half his security team. The penthouse would go into full lockdown, and if something went wrong at the meeting, if the traitor had backup, if the Bratva showed up, then he'd deal with it. His voice was absolute. This would end tomorrow, one way or another. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. at Adrian's primary warehouse in Brooklyn. Elena spent the morning trying not to panic, watching Adrian prepare with the methodical precision of a man going to war. He wore a bulletproof vest under his suit jacket, checked his weapon twice, and gave Rebecca explicit instructions about protecting Elena no matter what happened. He told Rebecca quietly that if things went bad, she was to get her out. Take her to the safe house in Connecticut, the one only he and she knew about. Keep her there until he came for her. Rebecca asked bluntly, what if he didn't come? Then he told her to contact his attorney, who had instructions for her and the baby. Adrian kissed Elena goodbye, long and deep. He loved them both. She whispered for him to come back to them, whatever happened. Always. Then he was gone, and Elena was alone with Rebecca and two guards she barely knew, locked inside a penthouse that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. She tried to distract herself, watched television without seeing it, attempted to read, and finally gave up and stood by the windows, watching the city go about its business while her world balanced on a knife's edge. Her phone buzzed. A text from Adrian. Meeting starting. Stay safe. Elena stared at the message, willing it to contain more information, some reassurance that everything would be okay. But she knew better. In Adrian's world, nothing was guaranteed except violence and consequences. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. Elena's phone remained silent. She told Rebecca this was taking too long. Rebecca said meetings like this could run long, with lots of posturing and politics. But she checked her own phone, frowning at the lack of updates. Another 30 minutes. Elena's nerves were screaming. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 2 years of desperate survival. Then her phone rang, an unknown number. Rebecca was beside her instantly, telling her not to answer it. Elena said it could be Adrian. Rebecca argued that if it was Adrian, it would show his number. Rebecca tried to take the phone, but Elena answered before she could. The voice was male, accented, unfamiliar, Russian. He said they needed to talk about her husband. Elena's blood turned to ice. She asked who this was. He said it was someone who has something Adrian wants very much. He came to a meeting today and asked very dangerous questions, questions that upset his employers. She asked where he was, what they did to him. He said he was alive for now. Whether he stays that way depends entirely on her. Rebecca was already on her other phone, frantically texting. The guards moved to the windows, weapons drawn. Elena asked what he wanted. She forced the words past her terror. He wanted her in exchange for her husband. The voice was calm, almost pleasant. He told her to come alone to the address he was about to send. She had 2 hours. If she was late, if she brought anyone with her, if she contacted the police, Adrian De Lorenzo would die screaming. 2 hours. The clock starts now. The line went dead. A text came through immediately. An address in Red Hook, an abandoned industrial area. Rebecca grabbed Elena's shoulders. She wasn't going. This was obviously a trap. Elena argued they had Adrian. Rebecca said they didn't know that. It could be a trick to get to her. And if it wasn't? If he was really in danger and she didn't go? Elena pulled away. She couldn't risk his life. She wouldn't. Rebecca said they'd go in with a full team, tactical approach, overwhelming force. They said to come alone. Rebecca said they also said they'd kill him if she didn't. Did she think they were planning to let either of them walk away? Rebecca's voice was sharp. She told Elena to think. They wanted her specifically. Why? To use her against Adrian, to leverage his child, to complete whatever plan they started when they framed her. Elena's hand moved to her stomach. The baby, of course. A child made her permanently valuable, a weapon to control Adrian for years to come. She said quietly that she still had to go. But Rebecca was right about one thing. She wasn't going alone. She called Paolo Russo. He answered on the second ring. He said this was unexpected. Elena spoke quickly, urgency bleeding through. They took Adrian. Someone from the Bratva called her, demanded she trade herself for him. She needed his help. Silence. Then he asked why he would help her. Because they had a deal. Because if Adrian died, he'd never find out who really killed Vincent. Her voice cracked. Because she was pregnant with his child, and she couldn't do this alone. More silence. Elena waited, heart hammering, knowing she was gambling everything on a man who had every reason to refuse her. Paolo finally said to send him the address, that he'd meet her there. And he told her to bring her security guard. She was going to need her. 20 minutes later, Elena was in a car with Rebecca, racing toward Red Hook against every instinct of self-preservation. Rebecca had contacted Marcus, who'd escaped the meeting when things went bad, and he was coordinating with Paolo's people for a synchronized assault. Rebecca muttered this was insane, checking her weapons for the third time. They were walking into a trap with minimal backup against the Russian mob. Elena said she didn't have to come. Rebecca said yes, she did. It was her job. She met her eyes in the rearview mirror. Besides, Adrian would haunt her forever if she let anything happen to her. The address led to a massive warehouse complex on the waterfront, the kind of place where ships used to unload cargo before the neighborhood died. Now it was just empty buildings and broken dreams, perfect for the kind of violence that couldn't happen in populated areas. Paulo was waiting with 4 men, all heavily armed. He looked at Elena with something that might have been respect. He said she had guts coming here. Stupid guts, but guts. He handed her a bulletproof vest and told her to put it on. He explained the plan. His guys and Rebecca's team would create a distraction at the front. She and he would go in the back, find Adrian, and get him out. Paulo's expression was grim. This was going to be ugly. The Bratva doesn't take prisoners, and they sure as hell don't let people walk away. She said then they wouldn't give them a choice. They moved into position. Elena's heart was trying to beat out of her chest, adrenaline making everything sharp and bright and terrifying. She'd never held a gun before. Never imagined she'd be sneaking into a warehouse to rescue the crime boss she'd accidentally married and definitely fallen in love with. Life was strange. Paulo led her around the back of the building, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd done this before. They found an unlocked door, too easy, definitely a trap, and slipped inside. The warehouse was enormous, filled with rusted machinery and shadows. Voices echoed from somewhere ahead, speaking Russian. Paulo held up a hand, signaling Elena to wait while he scouted. Gunfire erupted from the front of the building, Rebecca's distraction. The voices ahead shouted, and footsteps ran toward the sound. Paulo hissed for her to move now. They moved deeper into the warehouse, and that's when Elena saw him. Adrian was tied to a chair in the center of a cleared space, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, his shirt torn. 3 men surrounded him, guns drawn, but their attention was focused on the firefight echoing from the front of the building. Elena started forward, but Paulo grabbed her arm. Wait, they needed a clean shot. There were 3 of them, and 2 of them. He told her to trust him. Paulo raised his weapon, sighted carefully, and fired. The shot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space. One of the guards dropped. Paulo fired twice more in quick succession. 2 more bodies hit the ground before the men even registered they were under attack. Paulo shouted for her to go. Elena ran to Adrian, her hands shaking as she worked at the ropes binding him. His eyes focused on her with difficulty, and she could see he'd been beaten badly. He asked what she was doing, that she shouldn't be here. She told him to shut up and let her save him, for once. She got one hand free, then the other. Adrian sagged forward, and she caught him, barely keeping them both upright. More gunfire. Paulo fired at shapes moving in the shadows, providing cover. They needed to move now. Adrian forced himself to stand, leaning heavily on Elena. They staggered toward the back door with Paulo guarding their retreat, and Elena thought they might actually make it. Then a voice rang out, sharp with command. Stop or he'd kill all of them right now. They froze. A man stepped out of the shadows, flanked by 6 armed guards. He was older, in his 50s maybe, with steel-gray hair, and the cold eyes of someone who'd done terrible things without losing sleep. He greeted her, saying it was kind of her to join them. He spoke perfect English with just a trace of an accent. He was Dmitry Kozlov, and he believed she'd caused him considerable trouble. Elena positioned herself between the man and Adrian. She told him to let them go, that his fight was with her, not them. He said his fight was with whoever threatened his operations. Her husband had been asking dangerous questions, interfering in business that didn't concern him. Dmitry moved closer, and she, my dear, became a problem the moment Thomas Brennan decided to steal from him. Elena said Thomas stole from Adrian, not him. Dmitry explained that Thomas stole money he was laundering through Adrian's organization, money that belonged to very dangerous people who don't forgive losses. Dmitry smiled without warmth. When he created evidence framing her, it was almost convenient. He could eliminate the thieves, frame De Lorenzo's wife, and watch his organization tear itself apart from the inside. Adrian's voice was rough but steady. He asked who helped him, who in his organization was working with him. Dmitry said he'd die wondering. He raised his gun, pointing it at Elena. But first, he thought he'd take something from him the way he'd taken from him. Everything happened at once. Paulo fired. Dmitry's guards returned fire. Adrian threw himself in front of Elena, taking to the ground as bullets whizzed overhead. She hit the concrete hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Adrian's weight pressing her down protectively. More gunfire, shouting in Russian and English. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Elena couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was hold on to Adrian while the world exploded around them. Then, sudden silence, broken only by ringing ears and ragged breathing. Marcus's voice called out if it was clear. The building was clear. Adrian rolled off Elena, pulling her up with gentle hands. He asked if she was hurt, if the baby was hurt. She said they were fine. She checked him over frantically. He was bleeding. He said they were just flesh wounds, nothing serious. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like he'd never let go. She came for him. She walked into a death trap to save him. She said, of course she did. She loved him. The words hung between them. The first time, either had said it plainly. Adrian's eyes were wet as he kissed her, deep and desperate and alive. He said he loved her, too, so much it terrified him. Marcus appeared, weapons still drawn, surveying the carnage. Dmitry Kozlov was dead. Paulo took a bullet to the shoulder, but he'd live. Most of the Bratva soldiers were down. Adrian immediately asked about the traitor. Had anyone from his organization been found? Marcus's expression was grim. James found him. It was Peter Morrison, his attorney. He was coordinating with the Bratva the whole time, using his access to embed their operation in his businesses. Adrian closed his eyes, pain flashing across his face. 10 years. He'd trusted Peter Morrison for 10 years, and the man had been betraying him the entire time. He asked where he was now. James had him secured, waiting for his orders. Adrian helped Elena to her feet, keeping one arm around her protectively. They made their way out of the warehouse, past bodies and bullet casings, and the wreckage of the trap that should have killed them both. Outside, police sirens wailed in the distance. Paulo sat against a car, his shirt soaked with blood, while one of his men worked on his shoulder. Elena told him he saved their lives. He said they were even now, that he helped her find out who killed Vincent. Paulo winced as the pressure bandage was tightened. Kozlov had Vincent executed because he and Thomas were stealing from the laundering operation. It was never about De Lorenzo's money. She said she was sorry about his brother. He was too. Paulo met Adrian's eyes. They were square, no more bad blood between them. Adrian offered his hand. Paulo shook it, sealing a peace born from fire and blood. The warehouse had been the Bratva's headquarters for their laundering operation. Inside, James had found Peter Morrison trying to destroy evidence, computer files, financial records, everything that would prove his betrayal. He'd confessed under pressure, admitted to helping the Kozlov family infiltrate Adrian's organization, and to creating the false evidence against Elena when Thomas and Vincent's theft threatened to expose the whole scheme. When they returned to the penthouse hours later, James asked what he wanted him to do with him. Adrian looked at Elena, at the woman carrying his child, the woman who'd risked everything to save him, then back at James. He told him to turn him over to the authorities. All the evidence, all his crimes. Let the legal system handle it. James blinked in surprise. He reminded him that he betrayed him. Adrian said the usual response would make him no different from Dmitry Kozlov, from all the monsters he'd spent his life fighting. He pulled Elena close. He was done with that life, done with the violence and revenge and darkness. They were going to build something better. In the days that followed, the transformation began. Adrian met with federal prosecutors and turned over everything his organization had on the Bratva's operations. The resulting investigation dismantled one of the largest money laundering schemes in the country. Peter Morrison was arrested and charged with enough crimes to ensure he'd die in prison. The evidence against Elena was exposed as fraudulent. Her name was cleared publicly. The accounts in her name were proven to be fabrications. The woman in the bank surveillance footage was identified as a paid actor, part of the elaborate frame job. Adrian began the slow process of legitimizing his business operations, separating legal enterprises from the criminal activities that had built his empire. It would take years, cost him allies and territory. But every morning he woke up beside Elena, felt her growing belly where their daughter was forming, and knew it was worth it. 3 weeks after the warehouse, they visited Elena's mother at her care facility. The older woman was having one of her good days, lucid and present. Elena held her hand and told her about the baby, about the husband who'd started as a stranger but become her whole world. Her mother said she loved him, seeing past the complicated story to the simple truth beneath. Elena said she did, more than she thought possible. Her mother said that's all that matters and squeezed her hand. Her father would be happy for her. He always said she deserved someone who'd fight for her. Adrian certainly does that. They stayed for hours, talking and laughing and sharing the small joys that had been stolen by illness and debt. When they finally left, Adrian wrapped Elena in his coat against the December cold. She thanked him for the upgraded care, the private nurses, everything he'd done for her. She looked up at him and thanked him for helping her protect the people she loves. He said it's what family does. Family. Such a simple word for something so profound. As they drove home through the city, Elena thought about how far she'd come. 6 months ago, she'd been desperate and alone, drowning in debt with no hope of rescue. She'd made a devil's bargain with a dangerous man, thinking it would be temporary, thinking she could keep her heart safe. Instead, she'd found love in the last place she'd expected, had discovered that the man everyone feared had been hiding the same loneliness she carried. She had built a family from the wreckage of their broken lives. The threats weren't completely gone. There would always be enemies, always be danger. Adrian's past couldn't be erased overnight, and the world he'd lived in didn't let people go easily. But they were facing it together now, not as a fake marriage or a business arrangement, but as partners, choosing each other every single day. That night, safe in their penthouse, Adrian rested his head against Elena's stomach and felt their daughter kick for the first time. The wonder on his face made Elena's heart ache with a love so fierce it was almost painful. He said softly that she was strong, like her mother. She replied that she'd need to be with him as a father. He looked up, his eyes serious. He was going to be better for her, for both of them. He meant what he said about leaving the criminal life behind. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But he was done being the monster everyone thinks he is. Elena ran her fingers through his hair. He was never a monster to her. He was the man who saved her mother's life, who protected her when she had no one else, who chose love, even when it made him vulnerable. He said she made him want to be better. No, she just helped him remember who he really was underneath all the armor. They fell asleep tangled together, two people who'd found home in each other's arms. Outside, the city glittered with infinite possibility, with the promise of new beginnings and second chances. The contract marriage that had brought them together was long forgotten. What remained was something real and hard-won, a love forged in fire, tested by violence, and proven stronger than any force trying to tear them apart. In the morning, they would start planning their real wedding, the one that mattered. They would begin building a life that honored both their pasts and their future. They would prepare for their daughter's arrival and all the joy and chaos she would bring. But tonight, they simply held each other and marveled at the impossible journey that had led them here. From stranger spouses to something far more precious, two broken people who'd found exactly what they needed in each other. The story that had started with desperation and pretense was becoming something beautiful. And the best part, the part that made Elena's heart overflow with happiness, was knowing this was just the beginning. Their real story, the one they would write together, was only just starting. 3 months later, Elena stood in front of a floor-length mirror in a suite at the Plaza Hotel, staring at her reflection with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. The wedding dress was ivory silk, custom-made to accommodate her 5-month pregnancy, flowing elegantly over the curve of her belly. Her dark hair was swept up in an intricate style dotted with small white flowers, and diamond earrings, a gift from Adrian, caught the late March sunlight streaming through the windows. Her mother said she looked beautiful from the wheelchair beside her. The older woman's eyes were clear today, focused and present in a way that had become more frequent since Adrian had arranged for experimental treatments at a private clinic, like a princess from one of those movies she loved as a girl. Elena knelt carefully, taking her mother's hands. She wished her dad could be here to see this. Her mother touched Elena's chest right over her heart. "He is, sweetheart, in here." He'd be so proud of her, of how strong she'd been, how she'd turned something that started as survival into real love. Elena's voice caught. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The first wedding was just paperwork in a courthouse. This one means everything. Her mother said that's because she wasn't the same woman who walked into that courthouse 6 months ago. She fought for this, earned it, and that man waiting downstairs, he's fought for it, too. Her mother smiled. That's what makes it real. A knock at the door interrupted them. Rebecca stepped in, elegant in a deep blue bridesmaid dress, her ever-present professionalism softened by genuine affection. She said it was time. The guests were seated, and her groom was getting impatient. Elena laughed nervously and asked if he really was. "Rebecca," said, "Marcus says he's been checking his watch every 30 seconds for the last 10 minutes. The man's got it bad. Rebecca offered her arm and asked if she was ready to make this official. The ceremony was being held in the plaza's grand ballroom, transformed into a garden of white roses and soft candlelight. It was smaller than the elaborate society weddings Adrian could have arranged. Only 50 guests, mostly people who truly mattered. James and Marcus stood with Adrian at the altar. Paolo Russo was there with his girlfriend, having become an unexpected ally and something close to a friend. Elena's former co-workers from the hospital filled several rows, tears already streaming down their faces. But as the doors opened and Elena began her walk down the aisle, her arm linked with her mother's wheelchair, which Marcus pushed with gentle care, she only had eyes for Adrian. He stood at the end of the aisle in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and the expression on his face when he saw her made Elena's breath catch. This was a man who'd built an empire on control and cold calculation, who'd made enemies tremble with a single look. But right now, watching his pregnant wife walk toward him in a wedding dress, Adrian De Lorenzo looked utterly undone. Tears streaked his face unashamedly. His hands trembled when Elena reached him and placed hers in his palms. She whispered, "Hi." His voice was rough with emotion. He whispered back that she was so beautiful he couldn't breathe. She replied that he wasn't so bad himself. The officiant began the ceremony, but Elena barely heard the words. She was lost in Adrian's eyes, in the weight of this moment that was rewriting everything their relationship had been. The first wedding had been a transaction, a means to an end. This one was a choice, a conscious, deliberate decision to bind their lives together, not out of necessity, but out of love. The officiant prompted Adrian for his vows. He took a shaky breath. They'd agreed to write their own vows, and Elena saw him pull a folded paper from his pocket before changing his mind and tucking it away again. Whatever he'd prepared, he was abandoning it for something from the heart. His voice carried across the silent ballroom. 6 months ago, he hired her to play a role. He needed a wife for appearances, and she needed money. It was supposed to be simple, clean, temporary, but she destroyed every wall he'd spent 15 years building. She saw past the reputation and the fear to the man underneath, and she didn't run. She stayed. Elena felt tears spilling down her own cheeks. Adrian continued. He'd done terrible things in his life, hurt people, made choices he can't take back. He thought he'd lost the right to have something good, something pure. Then she walked into his world with her courage and her kindness and her absolutely terrible poker face. And suddenly he wanted to be better. Not for business or strategy or power, but for her. His hands tightened on hers. He wasn't promising her a perfect life. His past has teeth, and there will be days when the darkness creeps back in. But he promised this. He will love her with everything he is. He will protect her and their daughter with his last breath. He will work every single day to be the man she sees when she looks at him with those eyes that still make his heart stop. And he will thank whatever force in the universe brought her to him for the rest of his life. The room was silent except for the sound of soft crying. Elena took her own shaky breath, abandoned her carefully written vows just as Adrian had, and spoke from the raw truth of her heart. When she married him the first time, she thought she was selling part of herself to survive. She thought she could keep her heart safe, maintain distance, get through 6 months, and walk away unscathed. She laughed through her tears. She was so wrong. He didn't let her hide, didn't accept the careful walls she tried to maintain. He pushed and challenged and saw her. Really saw her in ways no one ever had. Adrian's thumb traced circles on her palm, a gesture of comfort that had become their private language. She said he made her feel safe when her whole world was falling apart. He gave her mother care and dignity when she couldn't afford either. He put his life on the line to protect hers, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Elena's voice strengthened, and somewhere in the middle of all that danger and chaos, she fell completely in love with him. Not the crime boss, not the dangerous man everyone fears. Just Adrian, the man who cries at ultrasounds and brings her ginger tea at 3 in the morning and reads pregnancy books like he's studying for a final exam. Laughter rippled through the guests. Adrian grinned through his tears. Elena continued. So she promised him this. She will stand beside him as he builds a better life, a legitimate legacy for their daughter. She will be his light when the darkness feels too heavy. She will love him on the hard days and the easy ones, when he's strong and when he's vulnerable. And she will remind him every single day that he deserves this happiness, this family, this love. Because he does, Adrian. He deserves all of it. The officiant was wiping his own eyes as he pronounced them husband and wife. Adrian pulled Elena into a kiss that was tender and fierce, and filled with the promise of everything they were becoming together. The ballroom erupted in applause and cheers, but Elena barely heard it over the pounding of her heart. This was real. They were real. Everything that came before, the contract, the danger, the pretense, had been burned away, leaving only this truth. They belonged to each other. The reception was a blur of joy and laughter. Elena danced with Adrian, swaying carefully to accommodate her growing belly, while their daughter kicked enthusiastically inside her, as if celebrating too. She danced with Marcus, who admitted that he'd never seen Adrian this happy, and it was frankly unsettling in the best possible way. She danced with James, who promised that the last of Adrian's criminal operations had been shut down or transferred to legitimate ownership. He said quietly that Adrian was really doing it, walking away from the life. He didn't think it was possible, but she made him believe he could be something else. Elena corrected him, saying he's making himself believe it. She just reminded him who he really was underneath everything. Paolo approached as the evening wore on, looking uncomfortable in his suit, but genuinely pleased. He congratulated Mrs. De Lorenzo, the real kind this time. She thanked him for coming and for everything he did to help them. He shifted awkwardly. Turns out she and her husband aren't as terrible as he thought. And Vincent would have liked, knowing his death led to taking down the Babratva's operation. He always hated those guys. She said he'd be proud of him for helping. Paolo's eyes went distant. Maybe he was trying to make better choices, to get out of the freelance violence business and find something legitimate. He said her husband had been helping with that, actually, offering him a job in his security consulting firm once he gets it fully licensed. Elena looked at Adrian across the room, deep in conversation with his attorney about the final legal steps in legitimizing his businesses. 3 months ago, she would have doubted his commitment to change, but she'd watched him work tirelessly to dismantle the criminal empire he'd built, to turn dirty money into legal investments, to transform from feared crime boss to respected businessman. It wasn't easy. Some of his former associates felt betrayed by his choice to go legitimate. Others tried to muscle in on the territory he was abandoning. But Adrian faced each challenge with the same ruthless efficiency he'd once used for darker purposes. And slowly, steadily, the transformation was taking hold. As the night wore on and guests began to leave, Elena found herself on the balcony overlooking Central Park, the city sparkling below like scattered diamonds. Adrian joined her, slipping his jacket around her shoulders against the cool spring air. He asked if she was tired. She was exhausted, happy, and overwhelmed. She leaned into him. This was perfect, everything she never knew she wanted. Him too. He rested his hand on her belly, and their daughter immediately kicked against his palm. He laughed with delight. She was active tonight. She knows it's a special day. He asked if she'd thought any more about names. They'd been debating this for weeks. Elena wanted something strong but feminine. Adrian kept suggesting Italian names that connected their daughter to his heritage without binding her to his past. She said she kept coming back to Isabella, Bella for short. It means devoted to what is good. Adrian was quiet for a moment, his hand still resting on her stomach where Isabella kicked and turned. It was perfect. She'll be their reminder that even from the darkest circumstances, something beautiful can grow. Exactly. Elena turned his arms, looking up at the man who'd become her entire world. She loved him, her husband. He loved her too, his wife. He kissed her softly. He thanked her for saving him. She said he saved her first. Then she guessed they were even. They stood together on the balcony as the city breathed around them. Two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chosen to build something real from the wreckage. Below them, their guests were leaving, heading back to their own lives and loves. Above them, stars fought to be seen through the light pollution of New York City. The next 3 months passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Adrian converted one of the penthouse bedrooms into a nursery, painting the walls himself in soft cream and filling it with carefully researched furniture that met every safety standard. Elena attended birthing classes with Rebecca as her partner when Adrian couldn't make it due to business meetings, though he tried to attend every single one. The transformation of his business empire continued. Adrian sold off the last of his questionable ventures, invested heavily in legitimate real estate and security consulting, and began working with federal prosecutors to provide information on other criminal organizations in exchange for immunity for his cooperation. It was a delicate balance, helping take down truly dangerous people while protecting those who'd worked for him and were trying to go straight. One evening, reading over the documents his attorney had sent, Elena asked if he was going to testify against the Moretti family. Adrian's voice was hard. They were trafficking women and children. That was a line he never crossed, and he wouldn't protect people who do. The feds wanted his testimony to take down their leadership. In exchange, he would get complete immunity, and they would help accelerate the legitimization of his remaining businesses. She asked if it would be dangerous testifying against them. He said he'd be in witness protection during the trial. She and Bella would be protected too, under a different protocol. James was coordinating everything. He pulled her close. He knew it wasn't ideal, but this was the price of leaving his old life behind. He had to help clean up the mess he was part of. Elena understood, even if the thought of him testifying against the same people who'd once been his allies made her nervous. But this was Adrian choosing the right thing over the easy thing, choosing to use his knowledge to help rather than staying silent and complicit. She just told him to promise he'd be careful. Always. At 37 weeks pregnant, Elena woke in the middle of the night to her water breaking. Adrian, who'd been sleeping lightly for weeks in anticipation, was immediately alert. He asked if it was time, already moving to grab the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago. She thought so. The contractions weren't bad yet, but then she gasped as a stronger one hit. Okay, they were getting worse. The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes through empty 3 a.m. streets. Elena had chosen her old hospital for the delivery, wanting the familiar faces of doctors and nurses she'd worked alongside. The staff welcomed her with genuine warmth, remembering the girl who'd worked double shifts to care for her dying father. Adrian didn't leave her side for a second. He held her hand through contractions, wiped her face with cool cloths, breathed with her through the worst of the pain. At one point, when Elena was cursing his name and telling him this was all his fault, he just smiled and said she was right, and she was going to be worth every second. Isabella Rose De Lorenzo was born at 6:47 a.m. on a June morning, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She came into the world screaming her displeasure at the indignity of birth, and Elena fell instantly, completely in love. Adrian held his daughter for the first time with shaking hands. This man who'd faced down armed enemies without flinching wept openly at the miracle in his arms. He whispered that she was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Elena, exhausted and elated, said she had his nose and his eyes. Look at them. They were going to be brown like his. They spent an hour just marveling at her, counting fingers and toes, watching her tiny face scrunch up and relax and sleep. Then the nurses took Isabella to the nursery for her checkup, and Adrian climbed carefully into the hospital bed beside Elena, holding her close. He thanked her, for this, for everything. She thanked him for being the kind of father she deserves, the kind of man she knew he could be. He kissed her forehead. He was going to spend the rest of his life proving her right. The next few days were a blur of feeding schedules, diaper changes, and adjusting to the reality of being parents. Elena's mother visited, lucid and overjoyed to meet her granddaughter. Marcus brought flowers that could have filled a florist's shop. Rebecca came bearing practical gifts like burp cloths and infant first aid supplies. Even Paolo stopped by with an enormous stuffed bear and an awkward but sincere congratulations. When they brought Isabella home to the penthouse, reality truly set in. This tiny human depended on them completely. There would be sleepless nights and moments of doubt and the constant fear of making mistakes. But there would also be first smiles and tiny hands gripping their fingers and the overwhelming love that came with watching their daughter discover the world. Adrian proved to be a surprisingly natural father. He mastered diaper changes with military efficiency, could calm Isabella's crying with gentle rocking, and softly sung Italian lullabies his own mother had taught him before she died. He took night feedings without complaint, often staying up with their daughter long after she'd fallen back asleep, just watching her breathe. One night, holding a sleeping Isabella against his chest, he admitted he never thought he'd have this, a family. Someone who looks at him and sees safety instead of fear. She said Isabella was lucky to have him as a father. He said he was the lucky one. Both of them could have been killed because of his choices, his past. Instead, they were here, safe, giving him a second chance at life. Elena corrected him. They were giving each other second chances. That's what love is, choosing each other over and over through all the messy, complicated parts. 3 months after Isabella's birth, Adrian testified against the Moretti family in federal court. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and during that time, Elena and Isabella stayed in a secure location with Rebecca and a full security team. It was nerve-wracking, but Adrian called every night with updates. And finally the news came. The Moretti leadership had been convicted on multiple counts and would spend the rest of their lives in prison. When he returned home, gathering his family in his arms, he said it was done. The last tie to his old life was severed. Elena asked what happened now. Now, he said, they live, really live. No more looking over their shoulders. No more waiting for the past to catch up with them. He kissed Isabella's head, then Elena's mouth. Now they would build the future they've been fighting for. That future took shape slowly but steadily. Adrian's security consulting firm became one of the most respected in the city, hired by corporations and wealthy individuals who valued his unique expertise. The money he'd made from criminal enterprises was invested in legitimate ventures, real estate, technology, startups, and philanthropic foundations that supported causes they cared about. Elena returned to nursing school part-time, finally able to finish her degree now that money wasn't a constant source of stress. She specialized in oncology, wanting to help families facing the same nightmare hers had endured. Between classes and clinical rotations and caring for Isabella, her days were full and exhausting and wonderful. They established the Vargas Foundation in her father's name, dedicated to helping families manage medical debt and access quality care, regardless of their ability to pay. Elena's mother cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony and later told Elena that her father would have been so proud. Life wasn't perfect. Adrian still had nightmares sometimes, waking in a cold sweat from dreams where he lost Elena and Isabella to enemies who no longer existed. Elena occasionally felt overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood and school and being a wife to a man with such a complicated past. They argued about small things, whose turn it was to do dishes, whether Isabella should start daycare or stay with a nanny, how to balance their desire for privacy with the social obligations that came with Adrian's business. But they worked through it, learned to communicate better, to ask for help when they needed it, to remember that being partners meant carrying the weight together instead of alone. On their first anniversary, the real one, not the courthouse wedding, but the plaza ceremony that had meant everything, Adrian took Elena back to the same ballroom where they'd exchanged vows. But this time it was just the two of them and Isabella, who was learning to walk and delighted in toddling around the empty space. He said he had something for her, pulling out a small box. Inside was a ring, not the simple band she'd worn during their contract marriage, but an intricate design of white gold and diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. She breathed that it was beautiful. He'd had it custom made. The stones were from jewelry his mother owned, the only thing of hers he kept. He wanted her to have them, to connect their daughter to the grandmother she'll never meet. He slipped the ring onto her finger beside her wedding band. He said she gave him a family, a reason to be better than his worst choices. This didn't come close to repaying that, but he wanted her to have the something that shows how much she means to him. Elena threw her arms around him, careful not to knock over Isabella, who was holding on to her leg. She loved it. She loved him. He loved her too, both of them. He scooped up their daughter, who shrieked with delight, his girls. They danced together in the empty ballroom, the three of them swaying to music only they could hear. And Elena marveled at the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate transaction to a real family, from two broken people to something whole and beautiful and strong. That night, after Isabella was asleep in her crib and they were tangled together in bed, Adrian traced patterns on Elena's skin with gentle fingers. He asked if she ever regretted it, agreeing to that first arrangement. If she could go back knowing everything that would happen, the danger, the fear, almost dying, would she still do it? Elena thought about the question seriously. She thought about the terror of her being framed and hunted, the horror of the warehouse, the constant stress of living in Adrian's world. But she also thought about falling in love with a man who'd fought to be worthy of that love, about holding their daughter for the first time, about the life they'd built from the wreckage of their worst circumstances. She said yes, finally. She'd do it all again. Every terrifying moment, every impossible choice. Because it led to this, to them, to Isabella, to a life she never imagined she could have. He asked even if she'd known how hard it would be. She said, especially because she knew how hard it would be, the things worth having are worth fighting for. Adrian taught her that. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. He said she saved his life, not just that day in the warehouse, but every day since he met her. She said they saved each other. That's what partners do. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and joys. That parenthood and business and life would continue to throw obstacles in their path, but they would face it all together. These two people who'd found love in the most unlikely place and chosen to nurture it into something that would last forever. Years later, when Isabella was old enough to ask how her parents met, they would tell her a carefully edited version of the story. About a woman who needed help and a man who needed someone to trust him. About danger and courage, and the choice to love even when it seemed impossible. About second chances and redemption and building something beautiful from broken pieces. They would tell her that love isn't always easy or safe, that sometimes it requires the courage to see past someone's worst choices to their best intentions. That family can be formed in unconventional ways and still be real, still be strong. But most of all, they would tell her that she was wanted, that her parents had fought through hell to create a world where she could grow up safe and loved and free from the darkness that had once threatened to consume them both. The contract marriage that had started Elena and Adrian's story was long forgotten, replaced by a love that had been tested by fire and proven unbreakable. What remained was a family built on choice and commitment, on two people who'd been brave enough to let down their walls and trust each other with their most vulnerable selves. In the end, that was the greatest gift they gave each other. Not the money or security, or even the daughter who would grow up to be as strong and brave as both her parents. The gift was simply this, the chance to be loved completely, despite and because of all their flaws and scars and complicated pasts. And that gift, freely given and gratefully received, made all the difference. As Isabella grew, she would see her parents' love manifest in 1,000 small ways. In her father teaching her mother to waltz in the kitchen while dinner burned. In her mother holding her father through nightmares that still occasionally haunted him. And in both of them, working tirelessly to build a better world, not just for their own daughter, but for all the families struggling the way they once had. She would see her father's transformation from feared crime boss to respected businessman and philanthropist, and know that people could change when they had the right motivation. She would see her mother's determination to help others avoid the medical debt trap that had almost destroyed their family, and learn the power of turning pain into purpose. And maybe when she was old enough to understand the full complexity of their story, Isabella would realize that her parents' greatest achievement wasn't the business they'd built, or the money they donated, or even the foundation that bore her grandfather's name. Their greatest achievement was simply choosing each other again and again through every trial and triumph. It was building a love so strong that it transformed them both into better versions of themselves. It was creating a family that proved redemption was possible and second chances were real. That was the legacy they were building, not in boardrooms or courtrooms or charity galas, but in quiet moments of connection, in promises kept and trust earned, in the simple, revolutionary act of loving each other completely. And as the years unfolded and their story continued, that legacy would ripple outward in ways they couldn't predict. Former associates would see Adrian's transformation and believe they too could leave the criminal life behind. Families drowning in medical debt would find help through the Vargas Foundation and know that someone understood their struggle. People who'd lost hope would look at Elena and Adrian's journey and remember that sometimes the darkest nights precede the brightest dawns. But on this anniversary night, with their daughter asleep down the hall and the city lights sparkling beyond the windows, Elena and Adrian simply held each other and marveled at how far they'd come. From strangers to spouses to partners to parents. From a contract marriage meant to end to a real love that would endure forever. From two broken people barely surviving to a family thriving beyond anything they'd imagined possible. It was a story that shouldn't have worked, that defied every rule about how love was supposed to happen. But it was their story, written in courage and blood and tears and ultimately joy.